So we are very happy to welcome you. Since you are not so many people, I suggest you to come to the first rows so that it's more interactive with us, because the room is relatively large, and if you sit at the end, it will not be so interactive. So it's better to come, and more people are joining us, so we're very happy. And we hope to be on time. Is English okay for you? Okay. So our English is not so good, so we'll be able to understand each other's. We have modified a little bit the program, but the content will be the same, because we have 1 hour. The first hour will be in connection with also Oman, because we have to give a conference to the residents in Oman. So we will start with an overview on opioid toxicity, so that it will be also dedicated to Omani residents. And then we'll do the track as it was previously scheduled. Unfortunately, Dr. Rebecca MacDonald is unable to come today, so we'll try to do also her presentations. So Badria is trying to connect with Omani Center. Sorry? Yes. Okay, so today there will be mainly 2 speakers. So the first will be Dr. Hossein Hassanian from Tehran. He's responsible for probably the largest emergency medicine department dedicated to poisoning in the world. I think about how many patients per day, Hossein? 70 patients, poisoned patients per day in his emergency department. And of course, in Iran, you will see that opioid toxicity is a major issue. So they have many, many opioid poisoned patients. Hossein is also the chair of the scientific committee of the ASEAN Pacific Society of Clinical Toxicology. So we're very happy that he accepted to participate to this tract. And myself, my name is Bruno Megaban. I am the head of the intensive care unit in Paris, which is dedicated to poisonings. So we have less poisoned patients. We have approximately 600 poisoned patients per year. But of course, more severe poisonings. And I am intensivist. So I'm very happy also to be here, and I am a member of the Minatox board, and I was responsible for the organization of the scientific program of this Congress. So we are very happy both to welcome you to this symposium dedicated to opioid toxicity. So now we are in connection with Omani residents, and we will start. So good morning, everybody. Good morning to Omani residents in Muscat. And we'll start with an overview on opioid toxicity, and we'll talk about the opioid overdose crisis. And you are aware that this crisis is mainly in the US, but you will see that it is also, unfortunately, worldwide. So, as you know, today, opioids represent the first cause of toxic deaths in the US. You see on this slide the approximative number and percentage of deaths related to each psychotropic drugs, and you see that opioid, and mainly opioid analgesics, represent the first cause of mortality in the US. And this issue was recently popularized by the deaths of very important people and singers in the US, like Prince. This is also the case in Europe, but probably with less impressive figures. However, you have to know that in Europe, about 1.3 million high-risk opioid users exist, and it has been estimated that about in 85% of fatal poisonings, an opioid play a certain role in toxicity. So opioids are really importantly represented in the most severe and the fatal overdoses, even in Europe. When you look at the emergency department, and this is a study from Euroden work group, and this study reports all the drugs, illicit, mainly illicit drugs, that are responsible for the reference of a patient to the emergency department in relation to the use of a recreational drug. And you see that opioids in red are well represented among these 20 most commonly reported drugs to the emergency department in Europe. And of course, heroin is probably the most dangerous and is in the first place. You have also methadone and also buprenorphine and all other opioids. So why there is such a problem with opioid toxicity? The first reason is that opioids are more and more available in the world. And you see here, based on the figures from the US, there is a quite good parallelism between the amount of opioids sold on the market, the number of opioid poisonings, and the number of opioid-related fatalities. And you see that all these lines are going up in a very impressive way during the first 20 years of our recent century. This is also the case in Europe, and you know that since the banning of dextropropoxifen from the market, there was an increase in the number of codeine and tramadol prescriptions. And you see here also there is a quite good parallelism between the increase in the prescriptions of these two opioids and the increase in the number of fatalities attributed to tramadol and codeine. So all over the world there is an increase in the number of deaths related to opioids. Although there is a debate regarding the real consequences of the banning of propoxifen from the market. Of course, this slide shows you the evolution of the number of deaths in the UK following the banning of propoxifen. You see that, of course, here is the banning in 2005, and you see the decrease in the number of deaths attributed to propoxifen. But it doesn't seem in this study that there is a consequence on the overall number of opioid-related fatalities in the UK. So probably it's not a direct effect of the banning of propoxyphene from the market. Because in Europe, things are more complicated. I don't know exactly the situation in Turkey, but we'll have a presentation later on this issue. You see that according to each country, the kind of analgesic opioids used is quite different. You see in France, for instance, we have mainly the prescription of tramadol and codeine. But you see here in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, in the UK, the situation is quite different. So each country, each European country has its own uses and prescribes different opioids for analgesia. So that complicates the epidemiology and the figures of the opioid-related fatalities. But one important issue is that when you prescribe an opioid analgesic and when this opioid analgesic become available at home, then clearly there is an increase of the risk of overdose and of fatality among the individuals living at this home. And you see that this increase will also regards the individuals who do not receive opioid prescriptions because of misuse and because of the possibility of the family members to use these opioids that have been made available at home. So, first reason, opioids availability is increasing. So, second reason, opioids are responsible for addiction. It seems obvious today, but this was not the case 30 years ago. And you see that in the US, the physicians were taught that prescription of opioid analgesics is not responsible for the development of dependence and addiction. And this was based on a simple letter of 5 sentences published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1980, and which was uncritically cited as an evidence to support that analgesic opioid therapy is not responsible for addiction development. And you see on this slide the number of citations of this simple letter, which was based on an observational study among 1,000 patients, saying that there is no opioid dependence development. And of course, this information was wrong. And the physicians in the US were taught, based on this study, during years that they are allowed to prescribe opioid analgesics without any risk. And this was, of course, false. And based on such studies, the physicians started to prescribe analgesic opioids. And you see, the emergency physicians play also a deleterious role. And there were high-intensity prescribers and among the emergency physicians who prescribed large amounts of opioids that become available at home in those patients who consulted to the emergency department, probably initially for a good reason, but they prescribe a huge amount of opioids, and these opioids become available at home. And of course, as explained previously, supported the development of misuse and addiction among the members of this family. And of course, the companies, the pharmaceutical companies, profited from this situation with a very intense marketing among the physicians, the prescribers, but also among the patients. And you know that one company called Purdue Pharma, which marketed oxycodone in the US under the name OxyContin, is now accused for the deaths of about 500,000 patients in the US due to opioid abuse. And this is the members of this family, and they became, based on this only compound, probably one of the healthiest family in the world. Of course, due to all these reasons, availability of opioids, increasing number of prescriptions, the number of fatalities attributed to opioids increased during the 21st years of our century. They increased till about 2010. And you see here, there was a plateau in the number of opioid fatalities, just related to the fact that the American health authorities decided at that time in 2010 to ban from the American market just one product, which was the oxycodone that is able to be crushed and injected intravenously. So just at that time in 2010, just the banning of one compound from the market allowed to plateau and to stop the increase in the number of fatalities attributed to opioids. But what was the problem? Immediately, you observed here in red a decrease in the number of fatalities attributed to oxycodone, you see, but concomitantly, an increase in the number of fatalities attributed to heroin. So what was the problem? The health system in the US created opioid-dependent patients. When the health authority decided to ban oxycodone, which was abused by intravenous injection, these patients switched from oxycodone use to heroin use. And in 2010 till 2015, heroin reappears in the US, and the number of fatalities attributed to heroin re-increased once again. So it was not a success. And you see on this slide that the shift between the abuse of oxycodone and opioid analgesics to heroin was like simultaneously. You see that the number of prescription opioid use decreases, and in the same time, the number of heroin increases, like in a parallel way. So this really supports the fact that the development of opioid use in the US was only related to the development of addiction. So, first reason, opioids are available, more and more available. Second reason, you created opioid-dependent patients in the country due to a huge number of prescriptions. And even if you modify the kind of molecules that are available, patients are dependent, so they will change from one opioid to another according to availability. The third reason, of course, is that opioids are responsible for neurorespiratory depression in case of overdose or misuse. You know that the control of ventilation is related to centers located in the brain stem and mainly in the pons and the upper part of the medullary medulla. And you see here these two centers, the pneumotaxic center and the apnostic center. And these centers command those responsible for the contraction of the inspiratory muscles, and those are mainly located in the dorsal respiratory group center. And you know that inspiration is active, related to the contraction of inspiratory muscles due to these inspiratory neurons, while expiration is only passive, related to the fact that inspiratory neurons stop to stimulate the inspiratory muscles. So inspiration is active, related to contraction of the muscles, and expiratory is passive. And of course, in these centers, you have opioid receptors, and that is the problem, because opioid receptors are expressed in the centers that control ventilation. And you know that stimulation of these receptors, mainly mu receptors, will cause a dose-dependent depression of respiration. So all mu receptor agonists will induce respiratory depression. And this depression is related to a reduction in the brainstem sensitivity to CO2. It is related to a depression of pontine and medullary centers involved in this rhythmic respiration. It increases the apneic threshold, it decreases the hypoxic drive to respiration, and even it has some activity on peripheral centers like carotid body chemoreceptions. This depression is characterized by a dose-related depression of the resting ventilation with a reduction in the tidal volume, a reduction in the respiratory rate, and of course a consequent decrease of PaO2 and increase in PaCO2 with the onset of respiratory acidosis. Probably the mu2 receptors and some of the delta receptors are responsible of these side effects, while kappa receptors seems not involved or even protective in some models. So the centers of respiration are in the brainstem, and you have opioid receptors in the brainstem. So opioids are able to depress respiration, and that is the reason for the danger. And this is clearly demonstrated that when you use an opioid, even at therapeutic dose, you may develop respiratory depression. And you see on this slide, in relation to the dose of your opioid, and here morphine equivalent dose, you have an increase in the number of apnea during your sleep. So if you are treated with an opioid, you may develop apnea episodes, mainly during your sleep, and you may die, of course, if this apnea is prolonged. And this is related to the dose. And these apneic episodes may, in case of an overdose, goes till the onset of an opioid syndrome, which is the usual presentation of an opioid overdose. And you know that opioid overdose presentations includes impairment in consciousness, miosis, and bradypnea. And these three symptoms are characteristics of the opioid toxicity. And SpO2 and respiratory rate are surrogate indicators of ventilatory drive, although they provide rather limited information on the drug effects on ventilatory control, while the minute volume and the PaCO2 are the best markers to measure the ventilation, but unfortunately they are more difficult to access directly at the bedside. When you prescribe an opioid, you have to know that you increase the risk of fatality in your patient. And you see here, if you prescribe an opioid to a patient during 1 year, you will increase his risk of death by 50 times. So the availability of opioids, the increase in the availability of opioids will be related to the increase of the risk of death in the population. But the dose is not the only problem. That's an important point also to understand. There is, of course, a quite good relation between the dose and the risk, but the dose is not only the problem. And you see that on this slide. We compare in this slide the concentrations of various opioids, here methadone, and here buprenorphine and its metabolite norbuprenorphine. In the first line, in patients who died directly from an opioid overdose. And in the second line, in patients who were opioid users but died from another reason. And you see that the concentrations are almost the same. So it is not so obvious that death attributed to an opioid overdose is in relation to the dose or to the concentration. So there are risk factors for the development of opioid overdoses. Of course, one important reason is the molecule you use, the opioid. And you see here that the risk of respiratory depression from prescription opioid overdose is not the same, and it depends on the molecule. And you see clearly that fentanyl and methadone are the most dangerous molecules responsible for a highest number of fatality rate, while codeine probably and maybe tramadol are less dangerous. And you see, if you take one for the risk with codeine, you have about 22 for fentanyl and 14 with methadone. So the molecule is important. And of course, some of these molecules may also have additional mechanism of toxicity, and we will discuss this during the symposium. Like, for instance, tramadol is also a serotoninergic molecule. So all these additional activities on different receptors will contribute to the toxicity in relation to opioids and will increase the risk of complications and side effects. And fentanyl is very well known in this area because fentanyl may be responsible also for chest wall rigidity that contributes to the toxicity. And this complication is relatively well known and was suspected based on several observations from fentanyl-related fatalities. With fentanyl, death occurs in the therapeutic range in apparent non-naive opiate abusers. And that clearly questions the onset of dose-dependent respiratory arrest as a mechanism of the death. But also when you analyze these cases, there is a lack of measurable metabolite, norfentanyl, in almost half of the cases. And so that supports the fact that the death occurred very rapidly, probably in relation to this acute chest rigidity before the expression of a neurorespiratory central depression. So you have additional mechanism of toxicity with fentanyl that increases the risk of fatality onset. And of course, with the multiplication of the different molecules, the different compounds, you have new pharmacokinetic patterns, new pharmacodynamic patterns, and you see that the delay of action, the duration of action is very variable among the different compounds, and this is a difficulty to manage opioid-related toxicity and increases the risk, of course, among the patients. One important point also is the mechanism of toxicity in the chronic users. And this is related to the development of tolerance, but also abstinence. So there are two theories to explain why people used to use opioids are at risk of death. The first hypothesis is the tolerance theory. When you use an opioid, you will develop a tolerance. But it is supposed that the tolerance to the analgesic effect will develop more rapidly than the tolerance to the respiratory effects. So that if you have a tolerance to the analgesic effect, you will increase the dose, but the tolerance to the respiratory effect is still not here, and then fatality may occur. This is the tolerance theory. There is also the abstinence theory. And here, for any reason, a chronic user of opioids may stop his opioid use. And this is well known if the patients go to jail, for instance. Then the tolerance will decrease due to this abstinence. And when the patient will reuse or reconsume his opioids, then he will have a risk of death. And this theory have been assessed based on the measurement of opioid concentrations in the hair, and it was demonstrated that before the onset of an overdose, there is a period of decrease in the concentration of opioid in the hair due to this abstinence period. So you have both theory to explain the risk and the vulnerability of these patients. And of course, as you know, opioid is not the only molecule that is used by opioid abusers. And if you analyze the hair of those who died from opioid overdose, you may find almost all kind of psychotropic drugs in the hair. So they abuse many drugs, licit and illicit drugs. So there are interactions between all these molecules, either pharmacokinetic or pharmacodynamic interactions, and these contribute to the onset of fatality. Finally, of course, you have to know also that there is a genetic vulnerability among some patients, and this supports an increased risk of toxicity. Probably all of you know this very famous case, and this was a woman who came to the emergency department after the delivery of her child, but unfortunately her child died a few days after delivery. And it was demonstrated that she fed him with her milk, and she was treated with codeine at pharmacological doses. But she was an ultra-rapid cytochrome 2D6 metabolizer, and due to this genetic pattern, she produced morphine from codeine instead of producing norcodeine, which is an inactive metabolite. And this milk rich in morphine was responsible for the death of her child. And since this case, codeine is forbidden during during lactation, during breastfeeding in women. So it's a relatively new contraindication. But this is not only the only case, and you have also genetic-related vulnerability with other opioids. And this is the case, probably less known, with tramadol. You see that tramadol is metabolized in two active metabolites. M1 with cytochrome 2D6 pathway, and M2 with cytochrome 3A4 pathway. And this patient who overdosed with tramadol presented a very severe cardiovascular failure, which is not supposed to occur because tramadol has not so severe risk of cardiac toxicity. And it was demonstrated that this patient presented a very severe cardiovascular toxicity due to the fact that he was an ultra 2D6 metabolizer, so he produced M1 metabolite from tramadol, but also in the same time, a few days before his poisoning, his general practitioner prescribed him ketoconazole, which is an inhibitor of cytochrome 3A4. So he blocked this route, and his tramadol goes only in this way by the cytochrome 2D6, and he produced a very elevated amount of M1 metabolite, resulting in the observed toxicity. So gene vulnerability is important. The fourth reason for the crisis is the emergence of the new recreational opioids. And this is really the most important problem today. And to let you understand, I have produced this slide, and please, we will follow each line to understand, and you will see that there is 3 phases for the opioid overdose crisis. So if you remember, the first crisis, the first reason is the prescription of analgesics by the physicians, and mainly by the emergency medicine physicians. So follow this line, prescription analgesics. You see that there was an increase in the number of prescriptions of opioid analgesics and the number of fatalities till about 2010. And then, as explained, just here, there was a plateau in the number of deaths related to analgesic opioids, just related to the banning of crushable oxycodone from the market. But immediately, as you remember, there was an increase in heroin. Follow this line. You see here that heroin is relatively low, and then it increases here when oxycodone was banned. So this explains the second wave of deaths related to opioid overdose in the US. And this is between 2010 and 2015. And then follow the blue line. And you see that this is related to fentanyl derivatives. And it was relatively low. And then about 2015, it goes up like in a vertical way. And this is the fentanyl-related fatalities. And to date, it has been estimated that almost 85% of the opioid-related deaths in the US are in relation to fentanyl derivatives. So now the physicians created the patients, the dependent patients, and now the patients change from analgesic opioids to heroin, and from heroin to fentanyl, because of availability and cost, of course, because heroin, you have to bring it from Afghanistan, and it's expensive, while fentanyl, it's produced in the US territory, and it's like a pharmaceutical presentation, so it's more safe, you know exactly what you have inside, and it's much more available in the market. You can buy it from internet, from the darknet, without prescription. So this is the new recreational drugs. And why fentanyl? Because fentanyl is a complex molecule, but you see that it is easily changeable. You can create new derivatives based on chemical synthesis, and this is relatively easy to do. This is relatively easy to do, and you can produce very powerful molecules. And you know that probably some of these molecules are 10,000 times more powerful than morphine, even than the fentanyl. They are so powerful that some of these molecules, like carfentanil, and we'll have during this day a presentation on carfentanil. Carfentanil is available, but it has no possibility to be used or prescribed to humans because it's so powerful. It is used for elephants in the veterinary medicine, for elephants and rhinoceros and so big animals, but not in humans. But you can buy it on the internet easily. And you see here in Europe, we have the same problem. And you see here the number of seizures related to the new psychoactive substances. And in red here, those who have opioid activities. And you see a relatively evident increase in the amounts of opioid-like NPS during the years. And here, how you can buy them. You see here, this is a bottle with butyryl fentanyl, and it contains the amount to allow about 100 puffs. So you can buy this bottle from internet, and you can go to a party and use it. And you imagine the number of possible deaths among the people who will use this or misuse this in the party. So it's really dangerous. One interesting point also is to know that these fentanyl-related poison patients will present with the usual traditional opioid presentation. That means consciousness impairment, meiosis, bradypnea. But you see, in these patients, the onset of some aspects, some clinical aspect, may question and may probably suggest to the physician that toxicity is related to a fentanyl. And you see these patients may present tachycardia, may present hypertension, may present renal insufficiency, agitation, which are not common features with the usual opioids. So such features may question the possibility of fentanyl derivatives. Sometimes you may have additional symptoms, like here, acute skin and hair symptoms with this synthetic opioid called MT45. And you see you have the development of a folliculitis and dermatitis in the patients that may suggest the use of these opioid derivatives. But of course, one important issue is the toxicological analysis, because to really know which compound is responsible for the toxicity, you will require an analysis, a solid analysis, based on the use of complicated technologies, including liquid chromatography coupled to mass spectrometry. And you see that you have to probably use mass spectrometry in tandem or very sensitive spectrometry. And this is not available in all the countries and in all the hospitals. So that the final diagnosis is sometimes difficult to assess. And that's why in many countries you have no figures, no statistics, because you have no solid and pertinent possibility to make these analyses. So what to do? Finally, what to do? Last chapter. Of course, it is important that the physicians have to be aware about the risk of opioids with reasonable prescriptions, supervised dosing with long-acting opioids, and of course, the health authorities have to limit the access to the market of the most dangerous opioid molecules and to support the spread of opioids with better therapeutic ratios. They have to regulate the market of illicit opioids, and we will discuss this during the symposium to allow a multidisciplinary approach of opioid addiction, and this is important, with maintenance treatments, with different policies like supervised injection sites or needle exchanges. But this is not enough. Hopefully we have an antidote, and this is a very efficient antidote. It is naloxone, which is a pure opioid antagonist at the mu, kappa, and delta receptors without any agonist properties. And this antidote is available worldwide. It has been widely used to reverse opioid toxicity, is efficient. It is responsible for a dose-dependent reversal of opioid agonist effects. And it is relatively easy to use, although there are some inconveniences. We'll have time to discuss about this, because it may precipitate acute opioid withdrawal syndrome if not well used in the patients. But anyway, it is efficient, so we have a real efficient antidote. And it has demonstrated that in the majority of the cases, almost 80% of opioid fatalities, the death occurs at home 1 or 3 hours after the exposure and in the presence of a bystander. But this bystander do not do anything that is useful for the patient. He just observed the patient. So BCLS by bystanders are usually ineffective, not sufficient. And there was in the US and now in many European countries the development of a policy of preventing opioid overdose deaths with take-home naloxone. What is take-home naloxone? Is the prescription of naloxone to all patients who are opioid users so that they can put this naloxone at home, and in case of any problem, the bystanders, the family members, will be able to use the naloxone mainly by intranasal or intramuscular administration to prevent the risk of fatality onset. And you see here that this policy allows in the US the prevention of about 25,000 fatal overdoses in the last years. So it is really effective. and it's now developed in the European country. I don't know if it's available in Turkey, but you will tell us. So in conclusion of all this overview, opioid-related toxicity represents a challenging health concern worldwide. There are several reasons. The first reason is the increase in prescriptions with the increase in availability. And of course, this was based on inadequate prescriptions in the majority of the situations. The second reason is the development of dependence. If you use an opioid, then you will develop dependence, tolerance, and there are risks related to tolerance and, of course, abstinence if you stop using opioid during a certain period of time. The third reason is the individual vulnerability, and this vulnerability is related to gene, but also to non-gene explanations and reasons. And the fourth problem, of course, is the emergence of opioid, new psychoactive substances on the market. So all these reasons explain why we are facing now a crisis of opioid overdoses in the US, but also in the whole world, and in Europe for sure. I don't know in Turkey the situation. So preventing opioid overdose deaths appears as mandatory. It could be achieved with some policies like maintenance treatments, take-home naloxones, but of course for the future, new strategies based on preclinical findings have to be developed, but of course with more uncertain timelines for such developments. So thank you very much. We were in connection with Omani resident staff, and now my presentation is open to questions from you, from the audience, and maybe from the residents from Oman. Thank you very much. So please, any experience or any question? Yes, please. Maybe with the micro, because...
Dr. Hassan from Oman. In the hospital that I practice in, we have a lot of sickle cell disease patients most of them are dependent on opioids. What we use there, or what have been used since the last more than 15 years, they used pethidine to control their pains. So then they became dependent to pethidine. Like per day, they are coming, each one of them is coming around 3 times per day because he's dependent on pethidine. And each visit, he will take around 200 to 300 mg of pethidine. So I don't know if there's any alternative to that, how to solve this issue, and like if we can shift them to something else, and how easy it will be. Because they continued on that, because it was started by hematology since more than 15 years back.
That's a good question, if I understood everything. That's a good question. I think we'll discuss this later on, because we'll have different presentations on how to allow the treatment of dependence with different policies, with maintenance treatments, and you will have different approaches, because you will have the Iranian approach, which is quite different from the French approach, and you have different possibilities. But it's a complicated problem, and there's not one solution for that problem, of course. But as you understood, really, if you prescribe once an opioid, then you expose your patient to the development of a dependence. And then the problem is difficult, and you expose him to the risk of respiratory depression if he misuse his opioid or if he overdose. Another question?
Do you have any questions there?
We are waiting for Omani. No. No question. Okay. Okay. So we will stop. Okay. We have stopped the communication with Oman, and now we'll back to our symposium. We have changed a little bit the organization, and now we'll start again. I suggest to continue with the opioid receptors, which is the first presentation that was expected.
Did you give them the lecture?
I will give them. It was okay.
You are going to give them your lecture?
Yes.
So maybe we can give them this lecture.
Used in a theatre situation, you know roughly how much is going to knock somebody out, make them unconscious if you like. But what you're trying to avoid is giving people too much of the agent that will kill them. And the difference between how much will knock a person out and what will kill them is called the safety factor. And there isn't any agent that we know of that has a large enough safety factor to ensure that you can release it and just knock people out without running the risk of killing them.
And that goes to the cardinal principle of poisoning and toxicology, that the dose makes the poison. And when I teach my residents and students, we talk about a variety of different drugs and chemicals. If you look at ethanol itself, a typical one drink has 12,000 milligrams or 12 grams of ethanol, and that's just one drink. So to become intoxicated or impaired by ethanol, it's tens of thousands of milligrams. And yet other drugs, like Dioxin, for instance, is used therapeutically at less than a milligram, of 0.25 milligrams, a very, very small amount. So when you think about opioids, for instance, if we use morphine, we use typically 4 milligrams of morphine. But when we use fentanyl, we use maybe 100 or 50 micrograms of fentanyl. Again, it's an order of magnitude smaller. And carfentanil, then again, is a whole nother order of magnitude more potent. So it really kind of depends on the drug. And even if you think the tiniest amount may not be lethal, you go up by a small factor, and it's apt to be quite lethal. So the Moscow theater crisis took place in 2002, as I mentioned, and what had happened was that there was this theatrical performance. There were about 800 folks that were attending this performance, and then this group of Chechen terrorists basically took over the theater, and they had their political demands, and they weren't going to let anyone go until the Russians met their political demands. And they threatened to blow up the building. And this gripped the nation, not only of Russia, but also around the world. This was on the front pages. And they let a few of the children go, but they kept most of the hostages. And then on the third day, they threatened to start killing the hostages if their demands were not met. And so what the Russian security forces did is they began an assault of the theater, and there was a gun battle, and then they finally got control of the building. Unfortunately, many people died in this takeover. Now, this is a picture of one of the dead hostages. One of the dead terrorists who died. But there are also many of the theater goers died as well, or if they didn't die, they were certainly unconscious. And this is a bus of people who had been taken out of the theater. As you can see, they're unconscious, and the question was, what happened? And the Russians don't necessarily like to publicize a lot of the stuff that they do, and it was hard to get information about exactly what had happened, and it brought up many different issues. So what was revealed at the time was that there was apparently some sort of gas that was put into the theater, and the intent was if they filled the theater with the gas, that everyone would become unconscious, including the terrorists, and that the Russian military forces would then be able to, restore order and put down this action. But in fact, not only were almost everyone unconscious, but there again were all these fatalities, and it was kind of a novel approach to this counter-terrorism insurgency using some sort of gas, and the question was, what was the gas? And then there was a lot of speculation, because you think about a state-sponsored event, the Russian military, and the first thing you might think of is, well, is it some sort of chemical warfare agent? And when you think about chemical warfare agents, you often think about nerve agents. And so, was it a nerve agent? Now, there was a lot of attention to this because around this time and in the years leading up to this, there was the Chemical Warfare's Convention, which had outlawed the use of many of these chemicals. And so the question in the minds of a lot of folks was, did the Russians somehow go against the ban of these chemical warfare agents? And so people were thinking about, is it a nerve agent? And yet nerve agents generally don't just lead to unconsciousness. Often they can lead to seizures and status epilepticus and sledge-like symptoms as well. But that was not what was manifested here. So thinking about chemicals or drugs that may put people out, you think about, well, maybe benzodiazepines. Now, benzodiazepines generally by the oral route are relatively safe. If you take a massive overdose, you can certainly have a very significant CNS sedation, but typically to put someone out and decrease their respirations or kill them is usually through an intravenous route. There was no intravenous administration here. It was inhalational, and benzodiazepines we generally don't use inhalationally. So was it something else like BZ? Now, BZ, even though it's often the same abbreviation for benzodiazepine, is a incapacitating agent, which is considered a chemical warfare agent, and mechanistically it operates like a anticholinergic agent. Again, the symptoms were not really consistent with BZ. BZ has only been used by militaries. Not a lot of public reports about the use of BZ, but there's the long name of BC, and of interest, militaries across the world have looked at a number of incapacitating agents to be used on the warfare that may not kill, but may disable the adversary. And in this case, it would work through probably the confusion that one might generate through the use of an anticholinergic, because anticholinergics do cause a delirium. But that was not, again, the manifestation in these patients. And so when you think about patients that become unconscious, comatose, and then have respiratory depressions and may die from respiratory arrest, you think at the top of one's list about opioids. Although opioids as an inhalational agent, there really was very little experience about that. Although it sounded like the toxidrome that was associated with all these people from the theater sounded like an opioid toxidrome. So the Russians at that time said that they had used some sort of anesthetic gas, and that it was something potentially with fentanyl. So that was the information that they publicly released, although a gas, fentanyl is not usually a gas. It's used as a parenteral agent. So again, there are a lot of missing points. Now, there was a German toxicologist who had the chance of examining a couple of these patients in the ensuing days, and he thought that there was some sort of anesthetic gas. He wasn't exactly sure what it might have been. Maybe a halogenated anesthetic. Certainly, it sounded like some sort of inhaled gas that would put people down, but he was unable to do any sort of laboratory determination specifically. So I particularly got interested in this case because I had just come back from Russia about a month before this event, and I was over in Russia actually at this demilitarization conference. It was actually quite interesting. And I've been to Russia twice. The first time I'd been to Russia, I spent some time in Yekaterinburg, which is a city in the Urals, and it was a fascinating place. I spent this time at this toxicology hospital, saw a lot of interesting poisonings there, and it happened to be the same city that the Tsar was killed back at the time of the revolution. But when I went to this conference in 2002, I got to speak to a Soviet scientist, an ex-Soviet scientist, and I asked him, what sort of novel drugs had they investigated during Soviet times, and he said a very interesting drug, which I'd never thought would have been used by the military. He said they were trying to weaponize dioxin. Now, dioxin is a chemical that is not a fast-acting chemical, but it's a chemical that in certain animal species, particularly guinea pigs, is extraordinarily toxic. Although in humans, its toxicity is not quite like it is in guinea pigs. It may potentially be a carcinogen. That remains somewhat unclear, but it's known to cause chloracne, which is this very disfiguring dermatologic process. And what was so interesting was, now this, fast forward about 2 years, but the prime minister candidate in the Ukrainian elections in 2004 was Yushchenko, and during the midst of this election, he broke out with this very disfiguring eruption on his face, and before anyone pinpointed what it was, it certainly was suggestive of chloracne, and I thought to myself, wow, the Russians or the Soviets had potentially militarized dioxin, and here we have a prime minister candidate who is very anti-Russian breaking out with this chloracne. And as it turns out, he was poisoned with dioxin, and he had the second highest dioxin level that had been recorded up to that date. So the Russians were very interested in a variety of different poisons, and this goes back years before that with Georgian Markov, who was a Bulgarian journalist dissident who, on a London bridge, was stabbed with an umbrella that had introduced a tiny bit of ricin, which is a very, very potent mitochondrial inhibitor, and he died. At the time, they thought he died of septic shock, but subsequent investigation revealed that he died from ricin. Very novel, intriguing, and the Russians have a whole legacy of using poisons, even as recently as in the last year or so. But this was Alexander Litvinenko back in 2006, who died from polonium 2010. So by putting all this together, I'm thinking, there's the use of ricin, there's the polonium, there's the dioxin, and now we have this strange gas, which is not quite clear what exactly happened. So if you go back a few years before the Moscow event, there were a series of reports that were in the public domain. Subsequently, they've been removed from the public domain, but they were public domain about chemicals that were used for incapacitation and so-called less than lethal technologies. And this was of interest because in adversarial situation, you may not want to, kill the opponent, just disable them in some way. So there were active research programs from militaries around the world looking at some of these non-lethal weapons. So here it says that non-lethal weapons are weapon systems that are explicitly designed and primarily employed so to incapacitate personnel or materials while minimizing fatalities, permanent injury, etc. Non-lethal weapons will not be required to have zero probability of producing fatalities. So again, the thought is that the chemical can incapacitate. They may not be 100% perfect in terms of not causing a fatality, but the intent is not to cause a fatality. And there are a number of different approaches, some chemicals, but of interest, and this is kind of off the subject, but certainly of interesting, is some acoustic technologies. And you might have read over the last few years about various folks that have had these disabling neurological conditions thought to be some from noise. This happened at the Cuban embassy in Cuba and elsewhere. I think there have been some European events as well, using noise that may incapacitate, not chemicals, but again, this kind of less than lethal technology. So in 2000, which was right before the Moscow event, there was this report that came out about the advantages and limitations of calmatives for use as a non-lethal technique. And what's on the front page but fentanyl? So I thought, wow, this is really fascinating that, that fentanyl itself, which was known as this very, very potent opioid, was being investigated as a non-lethal technique, because we think, oh my God, fentanyl is so potent that it can easily kill. This report discussed this sort of drug class. It's not really a pharmacologic class per se, but the so-called calmative, which is to depress the central nervous system and produce, a coma perhaps. And the ideal calmative should be easy to administer, short onset of duration of action, should be reversible, hopefully. And there was a lot of research into this. And not only did they discuss calmatives per se, but they also discussed inhaled calmatives in terms of aerosolized opioids. Now, looking back then, no one had really, at least in the medical community, had been thinking about aerosolized opioids. It wasn't any sort of a pharmacopoeia approach to the treatment of pain, although in general anesthesia, one uses inhaled agents. They're not opioids. They're the hydrocarbon-based agents, but that's what's conventionally used in general anesthesia. So going back to this report with fentanyl on the front cover is actually a paragraph about carfentanil. And before the time, I'd never heard of carfentanil before, but it says carfentanil has gained new interest because of the recent pursuit of novel calmative agents capable of unconventional administration. Although not yet used in the human population, this drug offers the potential advantage of being administered to non-compliant or violent patients in situations requiring only indirect contacts. So you think, why did the Russians utilize such a strategy to try to put down this terrorist uprising? There was literature to support the fact that a opioid, a fentanyl derivative like carfentanil, may be an agent that would serve that purpose. I still couldn't get. Still wasn't clear to me about the aerosolization of this. I did an extensive literature search at the time, and there certainly wasn't anything in the medical literature. But there was this one report from this company, this drug monitoring company called Cross, and they were conducting a number of studies. And one of the studies they were conducting was on aerosolized carfentanil. I said, "Oh my God, we have a company that's monitoring a study using aerosolized carfentanil." All these people just went down in the theater. The Russians, although they wouldn't say exactly what they used, probably used aerosolized carfentanil. Now it's all kind of coming together. And so carfentanil was produced by Janssen Pharmaceuticals, the same fellow that developed fentanyl, and it's a fentanyl derivative. Its mechanism of action is similar to fentanyl. It works, through the opioid receptors, but it just happens to be much more potent, as you'll see. And at this time, it was actually available as a pharmaceutical, but not for people, but for big animals. And it was marketed under the trade name of wild nil, which was used to immobilize large mammal species, usually to move them from place to place, not to kill them. And in the package insert, it talks about how it had been demonstrated in deer and moose and elk and other sorts of large animals. And I have this one video here. Could you just tap, there's one more video here.
Matthew Mutinda is standing by with a tranquilizer.
That's in 10:45.
It'll be a few minutes before Wendy goes to sleep.
So this is a good situation. She's not too panicked. She hasn't given alarm calls, so the rest of the family are relatively secure. She can't quite figure out what's happened to her. She's been stung by something that really hurt, but she's okay.
So this carfentanil is not meant for people. It's meant for big animals like big elephants, and you get the right dose. It's used not to kill the elephant, but to sedate the elephant so they can move the elephant from place to place. And that was the intent of wild nil. So wild African elephants, an animal that carfentanil is used on, weigh between 5,000 to 14,000 pounds, which is roughly 26 to 72 times the weight of your average adult male. And we'll get into why carfentanil over the next few slides. So this was a table I put together. Soon after the Moscow Theater event, I got interested in the whole thing. I wasn't savvy to any data that was not in the public domain, but by piecing together what I've described, we wrote this paper. And I put together this table looking at the potency of carfentanil versus fentanyl versus morphine. And versus morphine, it's 10,000 times more potent, which is just extraordinary. Even versus fentanyl, it's 30 times more potent. So it's a very, very potent analog of fentanyl, as are a number of the other fentanyl analogs as well. Fast forward to 2012, this is the first paper, the first and I think only paper, that analyzed clothing and urine from the Moscow Theater casualties and revealed both carfentanil and raining fentanyl. So this is the only literature in the public domain that confirms the exposure, but what the Russians had used back then to try to sedate the folks in the theater, but not kill them, although they ended up killing many of them, was carfentanil. So if carfentanil is used to sedate elephants, why is it showing up in heroin? And that was the question that's come up in the last several years. Now, if you go onto some of these drug sites, so there's a number of drug sites where drug-using people share their experiences. There was this dialogue, this was back in 2011, about carfentanil. And one of the guys says, the last one says, "Oh guys, I just found this on another forum. A guy says he went down to Mexico, bought carfentanil from a pharmacy down there. This is the only report I've stumbled upon for wild nil, which is the trade name, as I mentioned. And I haven't found any for immobling. This stuff, it seems like that the stuff is safe for use as long as you take extremely small amounts of it at a time." So it was even discussed among the drug-using community as this really powerful opioid, although warnings that you have to take a very, very small amount. If you go onto the internet, you can find recipes to synthesize the carfentanil, and then the first reports starting in late 2016 about heroin being laced with this carfentanil at the same time that you could actually buy the carfentanil back then over the internet. So why carfentanil? It's about 100 times more potent, or 30 to 100 times more potent than fentanyl, but only slightly more expensive. So from a drug dealer standpoint, you can cut it into much larger volumes, creating stronger, cheaper highs, and the drug dealer makes a lot more money. So that's why carfentanil is out there, and the fentanyl analogs. There's a lot more money to be made by the drug dealers. And comments from users. One user was so distressed when he received a package labeled carfentanil, a free sample from his supplier, that he asked for advice on Reddit about how to dispose of it safely. Another user stated, the only use I could think of it would be to kill people. A third user said, dealers are just starting to learn how to volumetrically dose their fentanyl poison bags, but killing us in the process. We are their guinea pigs. So this is further data from that CDC article just showing that so much of the fentanyl, at least in this report, was now contaminated with the carfentanil. And it's only gotten worse, and it's not just carfentanil, but it's also a number of other fentanyl derivatives. Which leads me to the last slide in terms of how do you treat these patients. They're suffering from the effects of opioid poisoning, you want to try to reverse the effect. Now, we use naloxone routinely in the setting of any opioid overdose. Different people have different thresholds for use of naloxone. If you go by the textbook and those who are most experienced with it, we tend to want to reserve the use of naloxone for those who are having respiratory depression, because this is where it can really make a very dramatic difference and reverse the potent effects of the opioid on the respiratory depressive centers. Routinely, it's often used for patients that are CNS depressed, and you can wake them up, but you're running some risks if you do it routinely on everyone who's depressed. For one reason is you can precipitate withdrawal, which can lead to all sorts of other complications. Moreover, the half-life of naloxone is relatively short, and so if someone goes into withdrawal, they may not ever want to be engaged with you in the hospital, and they may want to just leave the hospital. But then the naloxone can wear off, and they can become sedated with the opioid, depending on which parent opioid that they use. So a number of problems with using naloxone on every altered mental status patient. In another situation, if they've taken a combination of sedating drugs, you may reverse the opioid and not reverse the other drug. For instance, as I've had personal experience treating patients who've taken both opioids and benzodiazepines, and they're sedated, and you think, okay, well, it looks like an opioid, their pupils are myotic, let's use some naloxone. You use the naloxone, and they don't wake up, but you put them into withdrawal, and one of the manifestations of opioid withdrawal is nausea and vomiting, but they're still sedated because of the benzodiazepine, and now they're vomiting and have a significant aspiration risk because they're vomiting in a sedated state. So naloxone is not to be used injudiciously. It's best used in patients that are manifesting evidence of respiratory depression. In terms of the dosing of the naloxone, it's not clear how much you need with some of these fentanyl analogs. What we've heard is that for some of these cases, they may not be responding to the usual small doses, and they may require larger doses. Now, naloxone typically is usually provided in ampules of either 0.4 milligrams or 2 milligrams. In the opioid-dependent patient who's suffering from respiratory depression, a very small dose is apt to reverse the respiratory depression, even less than 0.4 milligrams, like 0.04 milligrams. A very small amount may reverse the respiratory depression. It may not totally wake them up, but it may reverse the respiratory depression. It works at the small dose best with morphine or heroin, which is metabolized to morphine. With some of the synthetic opioids, there tends to be a need for a larger dose, like with methadone or sometimes with fentanyl or with some of the fentanyl derivatives. And so if they're presenting like an opioid toxidrome, they're depressed, and you don't think, although it's hard to know for sure, but you don't think that they've had a mixed ingestion, you would start off with a small dose of naloxone, like maybe 0.4 milligrams or even smaller, 0.1 milligram, and then you'd go up on the dose if they're not responding. If they don't respond, Ultimately, it may be because it's some other exposure, it's not even an opioid, or it's a mixed ingestion with the opioid is not reversing the concomitant ingestion. Typically, the maximum dose of naloxone is upwards of about 10 milligrams or so, and sometimes you do get a better response with a larger dose. The biggest downside, again, is the downside of withdrawal. But unlike benzodiazepine withdrawal or alcohol withdrawal, which can lead to seizures and other potential life-threatening manifestations, opioid withdrawal is usually a more benign presentation, with the caveat that if they're having significant GI distress when they're concomitantly CNS depressed, that may lead to aspiration. So one last concern about carfentanil and some of the fentanyl analogs is the risk of secondary exposure for the healthcare provider. They come in touch with the powder, not just the healthcare provider, the safety officer, the police in an occupational setting. Is it possible, because this drug is so potent, that just touching it or being in the same room with it is apt to cause some sort of depression? And ACMT, the organization that I work with, and others have come out with recommendations regarding precautions for emergency responders in the setting of fentanyl and some of their analogs. And on the ACMT website, which is acmt.net, under toxicology resources and position and guideline statements, we actually have a statement on preventing occupational fentanyl and fentanyl analog exposures to emergency responders. And here's the statement. You can look at it at your leisure. It doesn't downplay it as not being a risk, but for the most part, it's the chance of absorbing enough of it dermally is so low that one doesn't necessarily have to take special precautions beyond the usual precautions one would take with handling something that's potentially hazardous. And there's some detailed recommendations on the position statement. So with that, I think I'll end the little talk and open it up to any sorts of suggestions or comments. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Is it just the standard precautions?
Yes.
Are enough for the dermal exposure for fentanyl?
Yeah, the standard precautions. I mean, universal precautions and whatnot. But the concern by some folks in the occupational sector is you have to start wearing special gear, getting onto the whole get-up that you would with a potential sarin gas exposure or something like that. And one does not need to do that. There are still those who do get geared up, but we feel that's an overreaction.
May I ask a question?
Sure, of course.
Let's back to Moscow theater attack.
Yep.
We are facing... Yeah. I said let's back to Moscow attack. We are facing a lot of people that are coming out of the theater with respiratory depression, probably myotic pupil, and loss of consciousness. And we have not enough time to intubate all of the patients together. That's why the mortality was so high. So, in my experience, any comatose patients should get naloxone. And I'm not sure why their medical team didn't prescribe that.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you. So in the case of Moscow, though, the authorities didn't tell anyone what they were using. So yes, clinically it seemed like an opioid overdose, and they should have responded that way. But it had never happened before. I mean, this was the first time in history that such an event had occurred. And you saw some of the folks in the bus, and they were just comatose and no airway, and many of them died because they weren't getting the attention that they needed. Hopefully, we learn lessons from history. So if there is ever a next time, we would be better prepared. There were all those ambulances. I think there was one picture, I may have left it out. There were a whole bunch of ambulances right outside the theater, but no one was prepared with the naloxone because no one had said that that they're going to have an opioid effect, and so many people died needlessly, unfortunately. Has anyone in your countries seen any of these fentanyl analogs at all?
Most of the time, we don't know what they're using actually.
Yeah.
We just know the patient and symptoms, and we're managing the patients based on their symptoms.
Yeah.
Because most of the time, the patient doesn't know what he or she is using actually.
Yeah, yeah, and that's true in the U.S. as well. And one of the limitations of the analytical laboratory is that it often doesn't really provide this sort of information, as I think most of you recognize. Not to say that it's going to necessarily change the management of the patient either, for that matter, because you have to manage them based on your clinical intuition and acumen. But from a public health standpoint, from an epidemiological standpoint, it would be much more useful if we had that degree of granularity in terms of what they were using. We're currently, have applied for a research grant to study this further. But beyond the research setting, in just the clinical setting, we often have no idea what we're using. And the other thing, particularly with fentanyl, for instance, depending on the laboratories, is most standard, at least in the U.S. hospital laboratories, don't have fancy technology. Even in some of the best hospitals, what they use is simple immunoassays, which for opioids look for the analyte morphine as the analyte, and things that are metabolized to morphine. So codeine and heroin are metabolized to morphine, and so if someone's been using heroin or been using codeine or morphine, it's going to trip it positive. But particularly with the synthetics, like the fentanyls, it's not going to cross-react at all. And so if they were using pure fentanyl or carfentanil or one of these analogs, you'd get a negative test for opioids. And so that can be very misleading, particularly to the less experienced physician who says, oh, the drug test is negative, and you tell me he has an opioid overdose. It doesn't make any sense. But when it needs to understand the laboratory and its limitations. Yep.
This was a good point, actually. So to sum up, it means that if we face someone with the symptoms of opioid overdose, and we couldn't find anything in lab exams, including morphine, codeine, or the other routine opioids, we should be suspicious for fentanyl or the other alternatives. Do you have any sort of these patients in Turkey? What's the most opioid that they are using and they are overdosed? Morphine.
The socioeconomic level is so low, so they don't have any money to buy this type of drugs.
And maybe it is not available, actually. And maybe it is not available.
Could be, we don't know. I mean, we don't see a lot of patients with opioid intoxication, to be honest. And also we have some certain limitations to test these patients because of our laboratories, so we can't understand with our test results too. So that's why we are actually judging these patients with clinics. That's it. And most of the time it works.
Thank you very much, Professor. And Bruno, do you have something to add? Is it good we go in this way? most of the time, actually, lab exam don't change your management. That's the main point. You should manage the patients based on their presentation, not based on the lab exams. The lab exams is useful for research or probably for further public health concern. Yeah, but for us as a clinician, it's not very useful. You want to add something?
Yeah, except for the one case of paracetamol. So there, it's very helpful, and if you don't have that, it's very challenging. I mean, I have to say that, it's a side subject, but with paracetamol, obviously with the acute single ingestion, the level is very important. But all those other cases, either the chronic cases or the delayed presentations, then the level, doesn't help you. There may not be a level at all. In that case, you have to use your clinical acumen again and look at other factors such as the liver test. But with a single acute acetaminophen, without getting a level, it's. Well, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Well, again, most of the time we have no idea what they took. So I think we'd start with a smaller dose, but we would escalate the dose if they're not responding. And we would have done that even 25 years ago, the same thing, because with the synthetic opioids, methadone, for instance, and others, I mean, they may not respond to the low dose of naloxone anyway, so we would escalate the dose. There is no specific protocol for dosing for fentanyl overdose at this point, and so it's still more this generic approach.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? So let's go to the other topic. Number 8, please. Number 8. Yeah. Actually, opioid overdose is not just treating the patients, but also it has some effects on the public health. And nowadays, the statistics shows that the opioid overdose is rising. So, most of the time, those who are to be killed by opioids, most of them are not in the hospital. They are out of the hospital. So it came to the mind of the public health experts that they should do something out of the hospital to prevent deaths from the opioids. So actually healthcare facilities all together gathered, and they offered by WHO to prevent opiate overdose in the society. They called it SOS initiative. Next slide, please. Yeah. As you can see here, they aim to cover 90% of each level together. It means that they are intended to target the relevant groups that they may face the opioid overdose. They are not just professionals in the healthcare facilities. They might be their peers, they might be their friends, they might be their communities that they are living in them. So actually in this program, they are going to educate these people how is the opioid overdose and how they should act against the opioid overdose in order to save more life. And you can see that they are intended to cover 90% of those trained people to have access to a supply of antidotes. we mean naloxone at the top. So if they face opioid overdose, and if they have naloxone supply available, they could be able to save the lives. And finally, they wish that of those who have been given a naloxone supply with a carrying naloxone under them, it should be in their hand. It should be available. So if you see all together, it means that they are going to protect people against opioid overdose by supplying and by helping the other people to get more familiar with opioid overdose, those who are not mostly healthcare professionals, and teach them how to use naloxone for those peoples. And actually nowadays in many countries they are doing like this. I'm not sure, for example, in Iran we haven't such a program. In Turkey, I know you have not such a program, but for example, in France, they have such a program. So I want to ask Bruno, if you have any data regarding less number of dead people because of opioid overdose, comparing the past when the naloxone was just available for healthcare professionals, and nowadays that it should be available for many people. Mm-hmm. Coming to hospital. Mm-hmm. To push it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Respirators.
That means that to give time to pre-hospital medical services to come at home and to manage those patients. So it's not a question of.
Yeah.
So if you use this naloxone, you have to call
the ambulance. So this is a big concern. Actually, in many countries, it depends on the cultural issues. That when they are using naloxone intranasally, it means that probably they are going to treat the patients and they don't call the emergency and the other ambulances to save the patients. So it should run some research in different countries. But nowadays, the statistics shows that it was successful in those countries that were using it, and we should rely on them. Anyway, maybe they were advising that these people should call the medical facilities and ambulances again, and they may not follow. So it should be in the programs of the public health that actually educate more people on the consequences of these behavior in order to prevent further overdose. Anyway, you can see in the next, in the right side, that people who use opioids may encounter opioid overdose. And those who are around them, like peers, friends, families, actually community members, staff of medical facilities, and first responders, those are those people who may help them. So they should be involved in treating these sorts of patients. In my country, Iran, nowadays, the number of opioid overdose cases is so high. And many of them are dying because of lack of on-time management of these patients. For example, when the professor was talking about the difficulty in recognizing the opioid overdose in Moscow theater, it came in my mind that I had a patient that was poisoned by a carrot, and the other patient by a kiwi, and the presentation was like an opioid overdose. So exactly with myotic pupil, respiratory depression, both of them were child. And when we search for what's the possibility of being poisoned by an opioid by a child by using a carrot or a kiwi, we found that that carrot and that kiwi was washed with methadone. And this methadone was kept by his dad in the car. So they thought that this liquid is water, but in fact it was methadone. So they washed the carrot because the baby was eager to eat carrot after shopping, and we face opioid overdose. So actually opioid overdose is nowadays is affecting many people in my country, in Iran. And almost 10 million people are involved dealing with opioid and opioid overdose-related deaths. Because it is not just the patient himself or herself. It's the community that is involving. It's their families, the other member of the family. We have a lot of unintentional opioid overdose deaths because of filling methadone, filling the bottles with methadone instead of, for example, acetaminophen, instead of, because the bottles were the same. They used the drug bottles. So they put it in the refrigerator, and the elderly people in the home actually used that. And they came with respiratory arrest, and some of them died. Anyway, when we are dealing with opioid overdose, the people around us should be familiar with the symptoms of opioid overdose, and should find a way to help their family members. So actually by using web resources, by using posters, and even by using word of mouth for those people who came to our hospitals and they are facing opioid overdose, we can somehow help them to recognize the opioid overdose in the future. And you know, one of the main points that people get overdose is after our intervention. When you use naloxone for people, actually you're going to crave them for next usage of opioid, because somehow they go to withdrawal. And when they go to withdrawal and come back to home, they are seeking for opioids, and they come again and again and again, and sometimes they don't come again because they died. So the community should be prepared in order to fight against these situations, and this is not possible without public health interventions. But our talk, I expect you get some impression when you leave this hall, and when you see an overdose patient, just you are not visiting a patient. You are facing a public health concern. So you should get ready. You should aware the family and relatives that these patients may come again, and you are responsible to manage further overdose by going to somewhere. I don't know if there is some institutions, for example, in Turkey or not, and sitting somewhere and get some information, get some knowledge in order to fight against further opioid overdose. And also, our facility is a good area if we organize some programs for our patients who are hospitalized. We can ask psychiatrists, psychologists, and the other teams in order to have family stressing programs. Because most of the time they are not in a good family, and as you mentioned, many of them are poor people with bad connection inside each other, and they don't care about themselves. So the community and the public health should intervene somehow. And this is not possible without any previous arrangements. We cannot treat the patients and leave them alone, as they will come again and again. And probably they will advertise the act to the other people that nothing happened to me. So you can use opioid as well. So as I said, the healthcare facilities is a good area that we can intervene, because we can see more persons that at higher risks because they are overdose. And we can visit the family members and peers at the same time. You cannot convince them to go somewhere as a whole with the other family members. This is exactly a good area that we can put our net and get all people together. Patients, peers, and family members. Those essentials that are useful to prevent opioid overdose again and again. And if you have established something in your country, you can find a network of support and linking the patients to those maintenance therapies. And unfortunately, in my experience, those maintenance therapies, if you get them be free, sometimes they provide bad opioid maintenance treatments for the people. In my country, we have almost 7,000 treatment centers for opioid overdose. So that's a lot. And many of them are just distributing methadone as a maintenance treatment for those who are overdosed with, for example, heroin or the other stuff. And unfortunately, after a while, they are still prescribing methadone for weak opioids like tramadol. I am sure you have the same thing in Turkey. You have a lot of tramadol poison patients that they are addicted to tramadol, probably 2, 3, 4, 7 pills per day. And sometimes they come to you with seizure. That's a huge problem in Iran. And nowadays, the number one of the seizure in the community is tramadol overdose. So when a young man come to us with seizure, and sometimes presentation of opioid overdose, I mean respiratory depression, something like that, and myotic pupil, we assume that he or she is a tramadol overdose patient. Anyway, tramadol is a weak opioid, so it's not wisely, for example, to get tramadol from one patient and prescribe methadone to him as a maintenance therapy. If we are using maintenance therapy in our community, we should stratify it. We should, for example, use methadone for heroin overdose patients because they are at risk of HIV, they are at risk of the other infection disease-related, substance-related diseases. And it can help them to be on a regular diet of, for example, methadone, It can prohibit them from bad behaviors, from high-risk behaviors, and it's good for them. That makes sense. But for example, for someone that is using 2 or 3 pills per day, tramadol, it's not a good treatment to put them on methadone maintenance therapy, for example. So what is final consequence? Nowadays, instead of, for example, heroin overdose in my country, methadone overdose is at the top of the opioid overdose deaths. And unfortunately, many of them unintentional, like in the elder patients or in the kids, because they are at risk. So we have to discuss it in our community with public health authorities to overcome this problem. Otherwise, you will face the same problem that we have in Iran. Okay, we talk about that. It all refers to those facilities that make a network for them, to be engaged to them, and to provide supply for those people who are on maintenance therapy, etc. Okay, this is actually our ward in Tehran. We have some brochures all over the walls to advertise what's the consequences of, for example, using opium, using heroin, using tramadol, etc. And also we provide some pamphlets for them after they release the hospital in order to prevent further overdose. But honestly, I cannot see any difference. But it should be, probably it can be done and presented to the family members. You cannot just involve the patient himself or herself. You should involve the community. And most of the time, they are not care about themselves. So the other people who are caring, who are living with them should be involved. Okay, thank you. If you have any question, please ask. Otherwise, I can go to the next presentation regarding overdose. Yeah. No, I think, because we have in lack of time, no, methadone overdose, please. This is heroin, I think the number 3. Because we are in lack of time, I think as an example, I start something like methadone overdose, and you can expand it to the other things. All of them are somehow the same, with some minor actually differences. Number 3. Methadone overdose is a good example for us as a strong opioid with long half-life. Half-life of methadone is around 52 hours. So if you treat the patients at the emergency department with naloxone, when you see the half-life of naloxone that is much, much less than the methadone, you can expect to see further overdose in methadone overdose patients because of half-life. After a period of time, for example, the half-life of how long is the half-life of naloxone? Less than 1 hour? 60 to 90 minutes? Still the same. You can consider even 90 minutes. So if an opioid has a longer half-life than 90 minutes, you expect to see the further overdose. So all of these people should be hospitalized first. You cannot release the patients from the hospital. Please, methadone overdose, number 3. Sorry. You have it here. Okay, I can opiate receptors. I can use it again. Yes. go to Menatox. And number 3, yes. Yeah. I will use it again, so I come back. Now I want to continue. Thank you. So nowadays, methadone is produced in Iran about, and is using in different maintenance treatment center, something like 80 ton. That's a lot. And most of them are in formulation like syrup or tablets. We have different tablets of methadone that are producing in Iran, and one tablet can kill a baby. And for syrup formulation, we have 5 milligram per milliliters of methadone in each milliliter. So it means that 2 milliliters of methadone, it's equal to 10 milligram, and 10 milligram is enough to kill a baby like 10 kilogram. So it's a bad poison that if we use these formulations in our home, can kill the kids and even the other people based on the different dose that they used. Anyway, I'm going to pass the history in medical use. Let's go to, this is the advantage of the methadone maintenance over heroin. I talk in my previous talks. And accidental methadone poisoning, we have some risk factors that we can see, like very available at houses that the residents are under methadone maintenance therapy. Nowadays, almost 1 million people are under methadone maintenance therapy in Iran, out of 80 million population of our country. So that's a lot again. Syrup may be missed as cold remedies. In some cultures, they use opioids routinely as painkiller. And dealing with methadone overdose is completely different from the other opioids with short half-life. So I have a lot of bad experiences that we have some patients in our ward. We kept them for 24 hours. And when they release, they experience methadone overdose again, not by getting another dose of methadone. So that is a very dangerous, actually, poison, and we should be careful about that. If you learn methadone overdose, how to handle it, how to manage it, actually you are managing the worst case of opioid overdose that you can see in your life. That's completely difficult and very conservative, as they seem very well. But when they go to the bed and when they sleep, you can see that apnea during their sleep. So, and on the other hand, actually, one of our difficulties is that how to get them naloxone. Because you have two different categories of the patients, those who are naive and those who are not. You can easily deal with naive people. Because when you get naloxone, to them, nothing happened thereafter, because there is no withdrawal syndrome. But for these people, actually, when you use naloxone, if the dose is low, they experience opioid overdose. And if the dose is high, they experience withdrawal syndrome. And if they experience withdrawal syndrome in emergency department, what happened thereafter? They wish to leave the hospital against your medical advice. And what happened thereafter? They will die, probably in the next street or even in their home. We have a lot of such cases in the country that our emergency residents, our emergency physicians released the patients, and the patients died in the home or in the street with no subsequent management. So, what other risk factors are? The other risk factors are taking congestions. That's not unusual for those people who are using drugs, use the other drugs at the same time, especially with benzos and with ethanol. This is, for example, using tramadol and alcohol is very common in Iran. Why? Because of sexual desires. So they experience seizure and they experience respiratory arrest in different time intervals. So we should be care about that. Actually, we have an investigation in the past and analyzed the urine of different overdose patients that came to us, and we found that every patient is using 2.5 different category of illicit drugs. So they are not using just opioid. They may use at the same time stimulants. They may use alcohol. They may use cannabis or other illicit drugs. So one of our difficulties is that how to recognize them in a limited time in emergency departments. Okay, let's pass the metabolism. You know, like the other opioids, methadone have the same presentations. Almost all the opioids have the same presentation, unless by some points. All of them have a triad, respiratory depression, myotic pupils, and loss of consciousness. But do you think that this existed in all opioid poison patients? No. In our experience, we have some data. It shows that only 25% have shown triad of opioid overdose. And the other patients were in lack of some clinical manifestations. For example, when somebody is using tramadol and experience seizure, you don't expect to see myotic pupils in him or her because of seizure. So, but by the way, pinpoint pupils, CNS depression, respiratory depression, hypotension, bradycardia, and decreased bowel sounds are most clinical pictures that can be seen in opioid overdose patients. Torsade is one of the problems that we are facing nowadays with methadone overdose patients, because many of them are on a maintenance therapy, and during maintenance therapy, many clinics they don't take an electrocardiogram from the patients to recognize that QT interval is prolonged. QT interval prolongation is an indication of stopping the methadone. And actually, we have another study to see what's the cause of death in methadone overdose patients. And we found that almost in all of them, we have ECG abnormalities. And why what that? Because of prolonged maintenance therapy in these patients. And you can see the growth of acute methadone poisoning patients in our hospital during different years. It's up to 2011, and nowadays it's more than 150. 1,050, sorry. And the same, the growth of acute methadone poison in children. All of them are unintentional. And you see the peak here. Anyway, this is the story that we have drawn with legal medicine organization to see the cause of death in methadone overdose patients. And you can see that a lot of people were investigated, and finally, no, it's not with legal medicine organization, it's for children actually. We have 3 deaths in children out of 475 cases. Okay, let's pass the epidemiological aspects, it's completely clear for all of us that naloxone is antidote of choice for treating these patients. But the question is that how we should start the naloxone, and how we should we continue naloxone with pump infusion, for example, or just observe the patients to see what happened for them. Do you have any idea for your patients here? I wanted to hear your experience in Turkey, if you have any. How you treat the patients with prolonged opioid overdose. Do you have methadone overdose here or not? You don't have. Do you have buprenorphine overdose here or not? At least you have opium overdose here. I'm sure, because Izmir is a place that they produce opium, and it's one of the best places for cultivating opium, because the morphine of the Izmir is rich in the past to 50%. It's more than the other places. But probably nowadays, I'm not sure. I don't have any data. Okay. Okay.
We can identify the drug. So, yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah. I've experienced this buprenorphine situation one time.
Buprenorphine.
Yeah, buprenorphine, sorry. No, yeah, buprenorphine one time. But other ones, methadone, I've never seen.
Yeah. But I am sure some people here use opium extracts and opium, raw opium. Raw opium is also have a long half-life. No? My question is that, because most of you are involved in emergency department, and probably if these patients are hospitalized, you are not following them. Am I right? Okay, so let's start in this way. Imagine that someone with opioid syndrome come to you in emergency department. These cases may encounter respiratory depression or may not encounter respiratory depression. I mean, he or she may come to you with apnea or without apnea, just with respiratory, just with loss of consciousness and myotic pupil. Do your prescription differ for these two categories of opioid overdose patients or not? They are the same. Because in apnea patients, you have no time, you know? Just you should do your best at the first step. But for the other patients, you have enough time. So you can go by escalating dose of naloxone one by one. So what would be your recommendation? What do you do?
For us, the EMS is the one who bring the patient.
Yeah.
So they have the 2 mg ampoules.
Yeah. The ampoules of naloxone is, they have different. Yeah. Yeah, there's 0.4 and 2 milligrams. But you have 2 milligrams.
EMS, they have 2 milligrams.
Yeah.
So they give it Acil.
Yeah. 2 milligram instantly at
Some they give it. 2 milligrams. Without knowing it's
yeah.
or
Yeah. What's the problem with this dose?
can induce withdrawal syndrome.
Yes. They experience withdrawal syndrome. And what will happen after withdrawal syndrome? Yes. Yeah. You cannot work anymore in that emergency department with an agitated patients. Yeah. And again, that's a good point. If you encounter withdrawal syndrome because of using naloxone, what do you do? Do you use, again, opioid to reverse withdrawal syndrome, or you use something else? You use benzos. And the other, why you don't use opioid? Because it doesn't work. Because your actually sites of action are occupied already by naloxone. Naloxone has a good affinity to mu receptors, so you cannot use it unless very stressful opioids like fentanyl. Otherwise, you cannot reverse agitation by using that one. Anyway, that's not a good point that you precipitate withdrawal in those patients. You should do something else. So many actually people and many experts use little dose of naloxone. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We usually ask the patients and see the patient if they are using opioid or not. If they are naive, there is no worries about the dose of naloxone. But if they are not naive and they are dependent on opioid, the little dose should be the best. And usually we use 0.05 milligrams for a start. And see and observe the patients for a period of time. And if they need more opioids, yeah. But if you see your text, there in different texts there are different strategies. And actually we found that there are 32 algorithms for naloxone administration. Usually we use Goldfrank emergency toxicology. Some people use the Tintinelli, for example, emergency medicine, and they have different advice. And yes, we have already talked about that. Let's pass it. And what about the infusion of naloxone? If you found something, unfortunately, sometimes we cannot rely on the history of the patients that they give us. Sometimes they say, for example, I used tramadol, and finally we discovered that they used methadone. In these cases, the people may go to respiratory depression, and you lose them somehow. So actually, one of those points that lab exams would be useful for us are in these cases, because managing a tramadol overdose is completely different from managing a methadone overdose with a longer half-life. So for long half-life opioids, we usually prefer to use an infusion of naloxone for a long time. And for methadone, this is at least 24 hours if they experienced respiratory depression. So the next respiratory depression will come to you if you leave the patients alone, and most of the time, unfortunately. Just, I'm using methadone as an example. This is a good example because it has high affinity to mu receptors with a half-life. You cannot such an opioid in the community like methadone that would be harmful for the patients in terms of toxicological issues, not in terms of, for example, public health issues. Because for heroin overdose patients, we have to administer methadone for them. But we are facing them in an overdose case, so we should deal with them. Anyway, usually each 8 hours you reduce the dose until you cease the naloxone. And during this period of time, some people may experience, again, withdrawal syndrome, or they may experience opioid overdose syndrome. In each case, you double the dose, or you half the dose, or even you cease the dose. Okay, it was a rapid communication. Sorry for that, because we changed our presentations in order to make everything in the morning. Bruno, if you have something to add. Sorry.
Do you have any experience in Turkey? Because we have somebody who, but I don't know her, was supposed to present on opioid toxicity in Turkey. I will tell you the name, if you know her. Yeah, but I was to be sure about that. Somebody knows Dr. Arisi. Arisi, from Izmir. Ah, okay. So maybe because we wanted to shorten a little bit the symposium, so maybe you can make your presentation now. That's what will be the best, I think. Then we can discuss it, because she will talk about the situation in Turkey. Good. That's the best.
I think this way was much better. Yes.
And then we asked them. So we'll have this presentation about the situation in Turkey, and then we have some time. I think it's up to you. We have all our presentations, but you can choose which one we can do or which question you want us to discuss. It's up to you. But since we are not so many, we decided to shorten a little bit. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Tamam. Teşekkürler.
Çok özür dilerim. Şu alttaki iki tuşa basmıyorsunuz.
Tamam, sağ sol.
Lazerde şu üstteki.
Tamam. First of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee for their invitations. My subject is overdose management challenges, best practices in Turkey. I will try to explain the role of Turkey for the world opioid supplementation, epidemiology of drug use and opioid overdose in Turkey, and the opioid overdose challenges in management in emergency services in Turkey, suggestions for problem solving. And it's also stated, I think, in previous presentations, opioids is the largest proportion of harms related illicit drug use in the world. Right, and it has a high mortality and morbidity rates, and Turkey represents a large consumer market in terms of illicit drugs. Because of its geopolitical location, Turkey is naturally affected smuggling of opioids, derivatives, and chemical intermediates and other illicit drugs. It is located in the Balkan Road, and it's a key transport point for illicit drugs from Afghanistan to Europe. And if we look to morphine and heroin seizures in selected significant countries between 2014 and 2017, the number of heroin seizures is more than the number of morphine seizures, and especially acetic anhydride heroin precursor seizures is most common in Turkey. And according to European Union drug market report, heroin is the third most common seized illicit drug following herbal cannabis and cannabis resin, but heroin is the most encountered illicit drug among all treatment entrants, and the third graphic is showing that the number of patients treated for opioid addiction is more than the number of patients treated with the other addictive substances, and in this report also stated that all treatment entrants and first-time treatment entrants are in the European Union range in Turkey, and the quantity of heroin seizures and the number of heroin seizures are in the upper limit of European Union, and this that also confirming the important role of Turkey in drug trafficking. And if we look at the gender distribution, the drug use is common in men, and overdose deaths are increasing over the years, and opioid-related death rate are 24%. And of course, there is a problem of drug abuse in Turkey, and in Turkey, TÜBİM is the partner of European Union, the Turkish Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drug Addiction, and TÜBİM is attached to the Ministry of Interior, Turkish National Police, Counter-Narcotics Department, responsible for the coordination and implementation of the national drug strategy and monitoring the drug situation, and TÜBİM has assumed very important that is in this area. And according to TÜBİM's report, in 2018, the number of drug-related deaths decreased compared to 2017, which is published by European Union Drug Market Report. This may be related to TÜBİM's action plan, which is published in 2018. And if we look to gender distribution, men deaths is common, and it's in the common in between 25 and 44 age. And also there are some literature data about drug-related deaths. Between 1997 and 2001, nearly 4,000 deaths due to intoxication were reported in Turkey, and nearly 10% of them from drug overdose and toxicity, and opioids were implicated in nearly 40% of deaths. And in Çukurova region, the rate of opioid-related deaths among the illicit drugs-based deaths were high between 2007 and 2011, and the rate of medicine and narcotic-related deaths were nearly 14%, Ankara and nearby cities from 2000 to 2011. And we know the deaths related drug overdose, but we don't know the exact rates of emergency services admissions in Turkey, because our national poison information data is very old, and there are some local studies. One of them in a study by Tüfekçi et al., alcohol with illicit drug-related emergency service admissions rate was nearly 5%. And of course, at this point, National Poison Information Center data is very important, but UZEM published its last record in 2009, and according to this report, the rate of illicit drug overdose-related admissions to National Poison Information Center within 2008 was 0.39%, with the 12.6% opioid-related admissions. And if we look to gender distribution, drug-related emergency service admissions were common in men. And if we look to age distribution, the most admission age was between 20 and 29 years. And another study from Ege University, they reported that the opiate-related emergency service admissions rate is 2% among teenagers, and all of these teenagers had families, have low education level, high levels of smoking and or alcohol consumption, and live in deprived areas, and divorced. And the data about emergency service admissions is very weak at this point. And of course, these are pinpoint pupils, unconsciousness, respiratory depressions are the main clinical findings of opioid overdose. And in the treatment, of course, basic life support is very important, and timely administration of naloxone is life-saving, and it has intravenous, intramuscular, subcutaneous, and intranasal formulations. But in Turkey, sometimes to find naloxone is very difficult. There are two formulations: intravenous formulations for emergency use, and sublingual oral formulation for the use of addictive person. But naloxone is in the abroad active ingredient list. It isn't in the located National Poison Information Center's antidote list. And sometimes there are some problems of importing the naloxone, because it is brought from abroad via Turkish Medicines and Medical Devices Agency. And sometimes it can't find in emergency services or ambulances. And also, I think it's a common problem in the world. It is only used for healthcare professionals, and some relatives of opioid users who can witness an opioid overdose can find naloxone. Of course, there is no inhalational form in Turkey. And of course, for prevention is very important. And the patient who are opioid user who injects restarting opioid use after a period of abstinence are under the opioid overdose risks. And of course, World Health Organization have some recommendation for preventing opioid overdose. And one of these naloxone be made available to people likely to witness an opioid overdose, training of the opioid users' relatives about opioid overdose, and psychosocial support, opioid maintenance treatments, treatment with opioid antagonists such as naltrexone is very important. And with the World Health Organization recommendations, TUBIM published an action report. The report's name is 2018-2023 Drug Enforcement National Strategy Document and Action Plan. And there are 4 main points in this plan. One is prevention of drug supply, one is prevention of drug demand, one is protective and preventive services, and the other is communication in the fight against drugs. And in the protective and preventive services, of course, consultancy services, drug first support line is very important, but organizing emergency rescue teams and emergency services as a part of fight against drug is very important. At this point, to training emergency service physicians is very important, and emergency service physicians may encounter opioid overdose patients in emergency services, and they must know how to manage opioid overdose, and of course they must determine the necessities of emergency services. As a summary and as a conclusion, opioid poisoning is a major problem in worldwide, also in Turkey, and the most limitation for us is we don't have the exact data related to emergency service admissions related to opioid overdose. If we don't know the problem, we can take precautions, and training of physicians working in emergency departments is important, and TUBIM has action plan at this point, and naloxone must be accessible in case of opioid overdose, and improving emergency facilities is important to effectively treating opioid overdose. Thanks for attention. Yes, it's very important at this point, because if we don't know the problem, we can't solve. And the data is very...
President of the Middle East, North Africa Clinical Toxicology Association. And I'm also a board member of the American College of Medical Toxicology and an associate professor of emergency medicine and medical toxicology at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, and at the American University of Beirut in Lebanon. It is my honor to welcome you to the beautiful city of Istanbul. I also want to share with you that I am one more affiliation, that I'm also the assistant medical director of the Georgia Poison Center. So not to forget, I have many affiliations, so please apologize for forgetting one. And Georgia, Tbilisi, Georgia. So welcome to the beautiful city of Istanbul. This meeting has been a lot of hard work and passion for toxicology on behalf of Minatox, and as well as on behalf of the Emergency Physician Association of Turkey, that I thank sincerely for their support and their coordination and collaboration. I want to thank Dr. Bashar Jandar, Dr. Mohamed Gul, and Dr. Bashat Al for their staunch support to medical toxicology in Turkey and in the MENA region. Today you are participating in a course that is very dear to my heart. The course is titled Bridges Between Clinical Toxicology and Public Health. I selected the title very carefully because Istanbul is the sign and symbol of bridges between different cultures, between different continents. And I could not find a better title for this course today to really embody what we believe in as toxicologists. Medical toxicologists are also bridges. We are bridges with clinical medicine. We are bridges with public health. And I belong to a training school through my mentor, Dr. Ed Kilbourne at the CDC, and others as well at the ACMT and then the Georgia Poison Center, that really believe strongly that medical toxicologists are essential in the public health response system or the public health structure. So you are going to hear about all of these various aspects today in this program that we put together carefully. We are short on time a little bit. We are also going to be joined by the World Health Organization, Center for Environmental Health Action from Jordan via webinar, as well as by a colleague from New York City, New York in the afternoon. So we will have some online juggling to do, but we already tested it out this morning, and I think it's going to work out. I want to thank our sponsors, Toxins, which is represented by Ms. Lucy Schiffelbein here, Randox, as well as Response System International, and Integral Global Consulting. Please make sure you stop by their booth and say hello to them and thank them for their support. Without any further ado, I would like to move on to the next, our first presentation by Dr. Edwin Kilbourne. Dr. Edwin Kilbourne is my mentor. I met him in 2003 when I joined the fellowship at CDC Emory Georgia Poison Center. Dr. Kilbourne is the one that really instilled in my heart the importance and love for public health and injury prevention. He taught me a lot of public health principles that I use every day in my practice and in my career. I've asked him to talk about his career, his journey. Dr. Kilbourne, before retiring in 2005 from the CDC, had spent around almost 25 years at the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention as a Public Health Service Corps member. He is probably the pioneer of clinical toxicologist in public health. And his career is illustrious and marked by several key investigations that he led that really prevented thousands of injuries and death. He is going to share with us today his experience. He's speaking today as an adjunct professor at Emory University Department of Emergency Medicine, although he also works currently with another company called Leidos. Dr. Kilbourne, thank you again for being here with us, and we look forward to your presentation.
Good morning. Ziad, I'm pleased to be here. I think we probably got more from you than we ever gave you. But that doesn't matter. I'm pleased to be here. I want to thank the sponsors, and I want to thank you in advance for your attention today. Dr. Kazi asked me to speak about my career, and I found that, at least as far as I'm concerned, I'm not so terribly interesting. Can I have the first slide, please? Oh, I do it. Who do I point it at? Okay. Right. You know, I've had unusual luck in an unusual period of time when public health was changing and the world was changing in a way that brought toxicology to the foreground. And I've had opportunities not available to everyone. And I think that's part of what I've been able, that's been an enabling factor to help me do what I want to do. But let us pay attention. I cannot speak about the development of toxicology, clinical toxicology, in all of the countries of this area of the world. And so I'll confine myself mostly to how clinical toxicology developed in the United States. Let's go to the next slide, please. Oh, I have the, Sorry. Oh, my luck. The location and time. The U.S. following World War II was a very vigorous economical economy. I was in the generation that's known as the baby boomers. There were a lot of children born after the war. My father was also a respected physician scientist. He worked in infectious disease and worked specifically on influenza vaccine. And I often think of him as issues come up these days with influenza and what he would have done and how interesting he would have found it. I had a couple of illnesses while a child that required specialty care, and I went into New York City from the suburbs of New Jersey frequently, and I came into contact with hospitals, and I found them to be fascinating places. I also went to my father's lab, and I think I was stimulated there. I had excellent mentorship, and I had excellent students, like Dr. Ziad Kazi. In the course of my career, I've been influenced by such people as Dr. Sir Richard Dahl, the well-known British epidemiologist who died in 2005, I'm sorry to say. Dr. Clark Heath, a famous cancer epidemiologist, Dr. Henry Falk, who discovered the link or had a major part in discovering the link between vinyl chloride and cancer. Dr. Stephen Thacker, who is well known at CDC. He died young, and various parts of the CDC are named after him. And as I said, I have had great students and people to work with me. Now, if you go through clinical medical toxicology in the United States, you find really that the first impetus for it occurred in the 1950s. And that was because the war stimulated, we were running low on latex, for instance. And so various forms of rubber were being tried. A substance called neoprene was developed instead of rubber for tires. But the chemical industry just went really forward in great leaps and bounds. By 10 to 15 years ago, the numbers of known and frequently used chemicals in industry was in the tens of thousands, close to 100,000. The number of compounds that had been synthesized, developed, or reported on was in the millions, 6 or 7 million. And the American Chemical Society has a registry by which they keep the numbers. So it becomes a very difficult field when people are being exposed to all sorts of things. And so it was with increasing complexity that pediatricians, particularly because children, well, I remember having very young children, they'll eat almost anything. And you can, and any poison center knows that so many of the calls are about children and what they ingest. Many of the more serious cases are related to adults because sometimes their motives are suicidal or towards self-harm. That's infrequent with the children, of course. In the 1950s, there were literally hundreds of poison control centers. It became a popular thing for every hospital or healthcare institution to have this as something that would make add luster to their prestige, add something. But there was really there was little, if any, quality control at that time, and there wasn't a process for evaluating. There was no certification. Also in the 1950s is when Dahl who I think read medicine in the 1940s, started to get results from the British physician study. And one of the things he looked at was smoking. And it started to come out that there was an association with lung cancer. Dahl's work was was pivotal in terms of the United States response when Surgeon General Luther Terry made the announcement that lung cancer and smoking were associated. Of course, we know now that smoking tobacco is associated with many, many health conditions, but this is certainly one of them. So I believe it was for that and in his related work that he was knighted by the Queen of England. 1958, people started to be concerned with cancer, and there was some legislation which was not given great importance at the time, but it basically was called the Delaney Clause, and it was added to a piece of legislation regarding our Food and Drug Administration, saying that the FDA could not allow any known carcinogens to be in food. So this is a time in the 1950s of many chemicals starting to realize the problems of chemicals and what they represented for public health. So the precise words, I believe, are the Secretary of the Food and Drug Administration. That is odd because it's called the Commissioner of Food and Drugs, but perhaps that came later. Shall not approve for use in food any chemical additive found to induce cancer in humans or after tests found to induce cancer in animals. The problem with that is that as chemistry progressed, it's hard to say, it became harder and harder to say that there was nothing, not a single molecule of a carcinogen in food. If you think about it, foods are very, very diverse group of chemical substances. And so to swear about that, you have to be a very, very good chemist. You can't actually swear that I have not put in anything that is chemically a problem. So as chemistry became better in response to the synthesis of new chemicals, we really didn't know, and it was hard to follow the Delaney Law. In United States jurisprudence, there is something called a de minimis exposure. De minimis means that it's such a small thing that we're not going to pay it any attention. And ultimately, that was a concept on which low-dose exposures were regulated, such that if you have a risk for some additive ingredient in food that is less than 1 in a million in a lifetime by estimates, or perhaps 1 in 100,000, that you might that could be called de minimis, meaning it's not big enough to worry about. And that is a legal concept, that is not a health concept, but we developed it into a whole new area of public health and medicine in toxicology. So let's move along. We'll return to Delaney. Clinically in the 1960s, poison centers and clinicians continued to struggle to treat an ever-growing spectrum of causes of intoxication. The chemical industry was off and running and was extremely successful. Pollution became a problem because there weren't definitions of pollutants, and there weren't clear-cut rules about who could dispose of what and where they could dispose it. The US government tried to assist, at least the clinical side of the equation, by providing sets of reference cards on particular toxicants. And these made their ways around. I talked with my colleague, Dr. Barry Rumack, who is old enough to have practiced during that time, and who told me that the cards were usually one set per hospital, that frequently the cards, they were meant to be easily replaced when they were lost, and they actually migrated to patients' charts, away from the set. People would mark them up and so forth. So public health had developed further by having fewer poison centers, recognized as, they became recognized as a critical public health resource. But the problem of funding started to emerge, and it continues to this day in the United States. Dr. Rumack, I believe he made a great deal of money, but he managed to get consumer product data, including proprietary formulas, and to put them in a database, which became widely used as computers became available, also in the 1960s, were available to medical toxicologists. Sorry, I was going to say next slide. Yes. The 70s, the same trends continued. Certification of clinical toxicologists became an issue. And I think the early, I guess what we call now the first board in the United States started to function. And Paul Wax and Chuck McKay are here. Is that approximately the right date? In the 60s, or was it the 70s? 60s, okay, good. In public health, our air in big cities had become so polluted that President Richard Nixon was a Republican who's not typically the party that is seen as safeguarding the environment, actually created the EPA by an executive order, which was later confirmed by the Occupational Safety and Health Act, the OSH Act. Poison control consolidated even more into fewer but much better centers. And the quality control of poison centers became a concern and started to be addressed. U.S. public health agencies began to study with this began to have to deal with this Delaney concept. But it was a difficult area. How much are you going to absorb? Well, in FDA, if you have medicine or food, USDA safeguards food, EPA, the environment, how much, if it's in the soil, how much dirt gets in people's mouths. There were really no data at that time to really help move that study along. That's since been addressed, but slowly. And CDC got into the act, especially with regard to Love Canal. The Love Canal incident changed the country. It led to legislation that created the so-called Superfund. In other words, a way to clean up some of these dumps where people had just left all sorts of chemicals without regard or any thought for future contamination, the likelihood of very toxic chemicals getting into groundwater, whether they were, whether those chemicals were toxic or what. So in the 70s and beyond, risk assessment became an important area, mostly done with animal data, which of course raised the question of how similar humans are to animals. For instance, even in mammals, we don't all have the same organs. There's a distinct area of the mouse, I believe, called the forestomach. If the forestomach, which we don't have as humans, generates a tumor after exposure to a certain chemical, does that count? Does that make sense? You know, how much is de minimis? And how do you estimate that from animal data? How do you even treat the animals? Animals with, such as mice, with I think 1.5 year lifespans, rats with 2.5 year lifespans, how do they compare with a 70-year lifespan of a human being? The area of animal extrapolation, full of theory and not much data, became a very important concern. So that remains an issue and an area for study. Poison center quality remains an issue, but the American Association of Poison Control Centers has developed criteria to review poison control centers to see if they're adequately staffed and can provide information that's adequate to the public and to physicians or other healthcare professionals that come in. So that's an issue of which we should be proud, and we are proud because of the concerted effort of toxicologists. There are not very many of us that are clinical and see patients, but we're scattered throughout the country. But we come together and we make these kinds of decisions, and it's an important aspect of the way we function. Public health surveillance of intoxications began in a really meaningful way in the more in the late 1990s, the early 2000s, and continuing to this day. The Superfund legislation took a lot of money, and right now that is ratcheting down. On the other hand, the most severely contaminated sites have been addressed. They're not necessarily clean, but there are rules for disposing of hazardous waste now, and they're under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, as we call it, RCRA. It's not a word, it's just a bunch of letters. But those are the initials of that legislation. So let me conclude. Where we're going, both as clinicians and in terms of public health, is in a pathway that is coming together. When I got my certification in medical toxicology, I wondered if it was even appropriate, because I thought of medical toxicologists as seeing emergency patients. They're, the patient comes in, they're unconscious, the skin is wet, the skin is dry, the pupils are big, the pupils are small. What is the toxidrome? How do you think through this case? And that's not something I had been doing. I had been looking at outbreaks, and we'll talk more about outbreaks later in the week. And so I'm not going to address it a lot today, Ziad, I'm sorry. But also I see that my 20 minutes is up. So perhaps I should stop talking. But clearly, what we do in public health affects what the clinicians do, and vice versa. I found that when I was in government, to work with Dr. Paul Wax, who I see over there, and others in the American College of Medical Toxicology was tremendously beneficial. And I think and I hope that when I served on the board, that tests U.S. physicians for competence in toxicology. I did push, and Paul will remember this as well, for knowledge of public health and the importance of public health to such that it's become embedded as part of our culture now, our professional culture. Anyway, I thank you for your attention. I look forward to seeing you later in the week. I'm pleased to be the lead-off speaker. My gosh.
That's a tough job.
It's an honor. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Gilmore.
And I'd be pleased, I don't know most of you, but I'd be pleased to meet you as we go through the week, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gilmore. As well as fellowship trained in clinical toxicology. He's a regular supporter and staunch supporter of Minatox, and is going to talk to us a little bit today about the poison centers, the US model for poison centers and public health.
Good morning, everyone. It is an honor once again to be with you and participating in this great conference. Dr. Kazi has been very instrumental in getting me involved in these conferences, and today I'm going to be speaking about the involvement of poison centers in public health. As you heard from Dr. Kilbourne, you know, it started with physicians who were very much involved in identifying public health concerns, and then it was the role of poison centers to execute on some of these. Now, I've been blessed that I've been part of an organization that has been very much integrated into public health, and so as soon as I get my slides rolling. Will it show up on this screen? No. Okay. So I've been very fortunate that the program that I work for has been very much involved in public health. And so just a little bit about me. You heard Dr. Kazi talk a little bit about me, but I am trained in pharmacy at the University of California. I went ahead and did extra training in toxicology, and I have been working in the same poison center since the late 80s. So with 32 years of experience, I've been able to see our program develop. Now, just to let you know, I don't have any conflicts, but if you're unaware of where Atlanta, Georgia is, this is where I am based, is in Atlanta, Georgia, and my state is one that is, it has over 10.5 million people. We were a brainchild of a pediatrician. You heard Dr. Kilbourne talk about pediatrics being the primary patient pool, and it was very much that that a pediatrician wanted to figure out a way to get information to his residents, because these were the most common poison cases that we were getting. The key for us was in the mid-'80s, where our health department, public health, said poisonings are a public health concern. It was one of the very few poison centers early on that had an established relationship with public health. And so with public health recognizing that this is a concern, the health department not only designated us, but they also started giving us money. You heard Dr. Kilborn talk about money as being an issue, and when you're talking about hundreds of poison centers that started when this whole program began, now we are down to just a very small few poison centers, and I'll show you those numbers in just a bit. So in my particular poison center, you know, we've grown tremendously since I've started. And so just a little bit about us. We're one of now only 55 across the United States. At a time when the early 70s saw poison centers proliferate, just in my state alone, there were over 200 people that called themselves poison centers in the state of Georgia. But the state public health recognized we need to centralize this, these programs and designate only one center to cover our entire state. The staff that we have consists of nurses, pharmacists, and physicians. And when you talk about the kind of call volume that we have, nationally across our country, over 2.5 million poison exposures have been reported and collected. And in Georgia alone, we are recognized as the second busiest poison center in all of the United States. So up to 350 human exposures are called into my center alone. A good majority of those, nearly 9 out of every 10 calls, comes from the average person, not a healthcare professional. And certainly the ones that are, the cases that are most difficult are the ones that we get from healthcare professionals. The data has changed fairly dramatically over the last 30 years in terms of the call pool that we get. You heard about pediatrics being the primary pool. In 1988, when I got here, about 65% of our calls were about pediatrics. Now, that has decreased significantly to 50%. Can someone tell me why the pediatric exposure volume has gone down? I'll give you the answer in 2 words. Dr. Google. The reason why volume has decreased is the proliferation of the internet. I mean, you could treat everything from broken bones to poisonings now. So people are less apt to call us. Therefore, you see the decline in the numbers of cases that we get. As I tell my population in Georgia when I'm lecturing, I try to promote the poison center services because I ask them, would you rather trust an algorithm or would you rather talk to a healthcare professional? What do you think is going to be most beneficial to you? So yeah, and Alexa and Siri, you know, they could, you know, they're not as good as the people who are, you know, familiar with the most up-to-date data, using the most up-to-date resources, whether it's toxins or micromedics. Trying to convince them that a human is much better is difficult. And even when you tell them it's a free service, still someone wants to pick up their mobile and ask Siri if, you know, silica gel is a problem. So it's something that our generation now has to deal with because we've become so enamored with quick answers and bullet points. Oftentimes the conversations about poisoning just don't happen, and that's why we're seeing such a decline in the number of cases that we're getting about pediatrics. They are still happening. Don't get me wrong, pediatric poisonings are still happening, but people love their Google. So what are we getting called about? Well, this should be familiar to you because across most of the US poison centers, their data is going to look fairly the same, but analgesics obviously are at the top of our list, all the way down to foreign bodies and pesticides in terms of the calls that we get here at in our office. Now, the striking fact that makes us such an incredible public resource is our ability to handle these cases and keep a majority of these cases at home. This is where our money is. in preventing the unnecessary visits to doctor's offices and to emergency rooms. So when you think about the cost savings, yes, public health is investing in us, but their return on their investment is tremendous. And that's why when our state realized that in terms of the cost sharing of Medicaid and Medicare, giving us a little bit of money will result in tremendous cost savings. And the insight and think about this is the early 80s where public health said this is an important program to have. What's really disappointing and disheartening is that in the 80s, we were one of the very few poison centers, if there were even any, that were integrated with public health. If you fast forward to 2020, the numbers are not very much better. What is the primary reason why some of the people in public health don't integrate with their poison centers? Everybody claims poverty. Everybody claims poverty. And of course, as you look at everything from the CDC budget being cut to other poison centers' budgets being cut, our state has remained steadfast in saying poisonings are a public health concern. This is an important project for us. We're going to continue to fund. That doesn't mean I'm waking up every day and happy with my funding. In fact, before I came to Turkey, I was alerted that I was going to be cut about 15% of my budget. And I am pleased to tell you that while I was visiting a palace yesterday, I got a text message that said for this year, our money was restored. That's right. People who write the laws recognize that, you know what? Being penny wise and pound foolish, cutting our budget would result in far more millions of dollars. They wanted to cut us hundreds of thousands of dollars, but yet the cost to them would have been millions of dollars. And finally we got, after a couple of communications with state public lawmakers, they realized this was a very foolish decision to cut our money. But not everyone is successful as us. And so we've been lucky that we've been able to convince state public health that we need to be funded at the levels we're being funded. So when you look at the collaboration, as I said, I've been part of the program for over 30 years. We've been integrated with public health since before I got here. When we first started with public health, nobody else in the country was doing this, and we were managing animal bites and rabies. We were the depot for getting cases about foodborne illness. We were being asked to provide information in major public events, and I'll be talking about some of those in just a second. And then also, they wanted us to be able to provide a 24-hour hotline for people in our state that had other public health concerns, and you'll see some of those in just a second. So, they recognize that poisoning is a public health concern, whether it was environmental, whether it was occupational, whether it was in drinking water. They recognize that if they provide the public with a resource to call for information, number one, their jobs would be made easier, so their phone lines wouldn't be filled. And then they chose us because we're a 24-hour resource with medical professionals. So we established programs here that I'm demonstrating here, and I'm going to go into these more in depth because, for example, a poison center and its ability to handle cases regarding hurricanes, does that even make sense? You think maybe it's just medical, maybe it's just, an antihistamine overdose or a cardiovascular. Why is our poison center involved in H1N1? Why is our poison center involved in the latest coronavirus? These are all public health issues, not poisoning issues, yet they're coming to my center and saying, we need help, and can you provide it? So let's talk about some of these here. For example, rabies. back in the 80s, they asked us to work with them to provide care about animal bites. And one of the things that I tell people when I'm lecturing, here's the beauty of rabies. If you get bitten by a rabid animal and you start having symptoms, I tell my audience, there's only about 100% chance you're gonna die. Only about 100. But the need for medicine, the need for rabies prophylaxis, the need for the antidote is importantly held, and the decision making should be held by people who are more knowledgeable. Instead of just giving everybody the antidote, even though it's 100% fatal, you need to be able to have a program that identifies those patients at high risk. You need to be able to do it in a manner very quick, and you need to be able to do it on a 24-hour basis. We were that organization. And in the early 80s, unlike the other colleagues in poison centers, nobody had a program. If they did, there was probably less than 3 or 4 of us that had an active program that managed animal bites. Looking at the cost savings, just in making the recommendations or not for rabies antidote, resulted in a cost savings of over, $5-7 million. And just for funding us for a few million, you save 7. Hey, who wouldn't want to invest 1 million, and every year you get 7 million? Get in line with me, because if you have that money, we can make this kind of cost savings, right? What's another program that the state said, can you help us with? Well, there's a program that's a federal program that individual states are able to take part in, and that is the strategy of locating certain depots of antidote in strategic areas in the state in the event there's an exposure, a mass exposure to organophosphate poisoning. So the federal government gives the state quantities of organophosphate combating agents, and the poison center is the gateway to be able to utilize these resources. We know the secret of where all these antidotes are stashed throughout our state, and when a mass occurrence happens, whether it's a truck that overturns or whether there was a spill at a factory and it involves nerve agents, we have the ability to identify where the closest resources are. We have the ability to then release this antidote for use. One of the other things that we do is for our state, we provide our state the number of 1866 Pub Health, and you see the number spelled out there, but we have separate call center staff who answer certain public health questions, ranging from notifiable diseases, bioterrorism events, and other public health emergencies. And these are people that are utilizing the call center capabilities, and we're able to do this on a 24-hour basis. Now, who are the folks that call us on this special hotline that's contained inside the poison center? You see everyone from healthcare providers, pharmacies. We get calls from the quarantine office at our airport, veterinarians, a number of agencies, but the primary call base is going to be people who come from just the general public. Now, the thing about our hotline, our separate hotline, is this is a way for people to talk to us about everything from diseases, dead birds, mold, if there are feces in swimming pools. Where do people turn to when they need information? Who are they going to call? The state said, can you handle everything, like these, like restaurant complaints, mosquito complaints, hotel, food complaints? All those calls come into the poison center. So again, it's resources the state says, hey, we can provide it to our residents of Georgia. We could do it on a 24-hour basis. Now, the unique thing about these calls is we document these calls, and these calls immediately get uploaded into the state public health database. So there's no duplication of effort. A public health call comes in, We enter it into our system, our electronic medical records, and every 10 minutes, these cases automatically get uploaded to public health so that they see cases in real time. Now, those hotlines that I talked about, we know the clinical side of this. Acetaminophen overdoses, aspirin overdoses, calcium channel blocker overdoses. Those of us who are toxicologists know these are the routine things. But remember, we're talking about public health today. We're talking about the bridges of public health and poison centers. These are not traditional things that poison centers do. As I mentioned, we are dealing with cases that involve pandemics, endemics, hurricanes, disease monitoring, mass messaging. What are some of the examples? Well, I mentioned in 2005, the state said, can you help us with hurricane victims? Not from a toxicology standpoint, but from a resource management standpoint. People from Louisiana were forced to go to our state, but they had no idea about housing information, medical information, food, people who needed glasses, everything like that. The state said, we need your assistance and we think you could do it. Why? Because we had the infrastructure. We had a call center. We had an electronic medical record. We had a way to answer calls on a 24-hour basis. And so we partnered with Georgia Department of Public Health to provide these resources to the people who were coming to our state. This is not a poison center function, but the state says, we need your help. You are a public health arm. You are an arm for public health and public information. Can you do this? So we hired extra people. Within 2 days, I was able to train staff, and we were able to use our infrastructure and be able to deliver this program. What other things have we done on a mass scale? Well, we've been fortunate that we've had major events in our state. Those events include the Super Bowls, those of you who are football fans, 1994, 2000, 2019, and of course, the big event that we had to prepare for because of public health was the Olympics. In 1996, the Olympics came to Atlanta, but it was in 1992 that we were awarded the Olympics. And from 1992 to 1996, we were working nonstop to be able to provide certain public health information to the people who came to the state. Now, primarily we were looking at bioterrorism events, and so we all got fairly familiar with anthrax and nerve gas, and so we were ready to provide that information, and I'm going to share with you the mechanism that we were looking to use to do that. So, when you look at pandemics and such, in 2009, the state asked us, Dr. Lopez, can you provide a call center for people who have questions about H1N1? Again, this is not a poisoning, but they wanted to use our infrastructure of healthcare professionals who could work in a call center around the clock. And so they gave us a little bit of money that they would never be able to use to spend, to develop a program, but they knew they could use our infrastructure and be able to do and deliver these programs immediately. We started not only with H1N1, but we've done work in Ebola and Zika. Again, a poison center and infectious disease, you don't think these are partners, but we are in bed all the time. And lately, our latest project is working with the state on the novel coronavirus. Again, what is our role? We have been asked to take monitoring capabilities, meaning monitoring temperatures, monitoring symptoms, not a poisoning, but a valuable public health resource. So when the patients arrive at Atlanta Airport, they are told to call a certain number. They don't know they're calling the poison center. They know they're calling public health. And so again, we feel, honored to be able to help in these particular events. The one that happened that was a public health emergency happened just a couple years ago. We were in the news across the United States. You might have heard it, in your country. But with the opioid crisis that we're experiencing, there was an incident that occurred while I was on call, where at 10 o'clock at night, a doctor calls me and calls our center about how can we alert the public about an event that's happening in my area. And over the course of the last 24 hours, we are recognizing that there's something unusual going on. Can you help spread the word that we possibly have an epidemic in our state? Because in the last 24 hours, 5 patients have presented very similarly, where they have needed high-dose naloxone because of severe respiratory issues, all after getting drugs on the street, all having taken only 1 pill. We later find out that this exposure involved purchasing off of in a drug house. A small amount resulted in major problems, and our cases were being fed electronically into our system, and hospital data later confirmed in a syndromic surveillance study that there was something in fact going on. But who was the first agency to recognize it? It was the Poison Center. Now, this is a case where we're talking about poisoning now with a public health event. And so we were able to document a number of these cases. Our state public health director, our head person in public health said, hospitals in Georgia, starting now, anybody who meets patient criteria must be referred to the Poison Center. They must be able to report these incidents to the state Poison Center so that we could track these patients. So over 2 weeks, we identified almost 30 cases, and a number of these folks, you could see here the statistics on these individuals, and you could see that they all presented fairly similarly. When all was said and done, we understood all these patients were looking to buy Percocet, and when they ended up taking these Percocet, they almost died. In fact, 5 individuals died of the 27. We later identified this as cyclopropylfentanyl, not Percocet, and it also had another novel opioid, and we were able to immediately work with public health and our partners, our Department of Public Health, GBI, and other law enforcement. It's all because of how that call ended up coming to the Poison Center. Now, another program that we use that allows us to talk to people and multiples of people is using this problem called SUFER, and it stands for Surge Public Health Emergency Response System. What is that? In short, what it is a phone system that overlays on top of our existing phone system to allow us to simultaneously receive calls of from nearly 600 people at the same time. Now, we don't have 600 agents in our office, but you're able to develop messages that the public could hear regarding an event. So we used our existing infrastructure, we put messaging into the system, and it was a text-to-voice program where you put in the most common frequently asked questions and answers, and the public goes in and they make a call to the number, they enter their code of their county, they select a message, and if they're satisfied with the message, we've done part of our job. If they're not satisfied with the message, then they're able to find someone who is a live agent who can speak. So, in summary, it is an incredible relationship that we have with public health. As I mentioned at the very beginning, many of our other partners throughout the United States don't have this relationship. They don't have the luxury of being able to work with other public health agencies. And when you think about our collaborations, they've recognized that at least our poison center is an efficient way and a cost-effective way to deliver public information. We are always surprised to hear why other poison centers don't have the same relationship. But slowly but surely, I think public health is recognizing the importance of having a poison center, helping them with these kind of situations. And for us, I've been lucky to be part of a program that for over 30 years has been partnered with public health to not only provide poison information and treatment information, but also to provide valuable information for the public health in a variety of areas. It doesn't matter if it's bioterrorism, it doesn't matter if they're worried about mold or a dead bird, or of course now some of the pandemics we're seeing. We've been involved in H1N1, Ebola, Zika. We got called about, now we're doing so many things with the novel coronavirus. These are non-traditional things that we are doing, and we've been very fortunate that public health continues to support us. And yes, I will continue to fight for money that they take away from me. I will continue to tell them that if you cut me a little, we're gonna cut some of the programs to you a lot. And when they realize the people who push pencils, the lawmakers who write the laws, it's easy on paper to say, well, cut Dr. Kilburn's program by 10%. We have to achieve a bottom line. We realize that people do listen to us. We realize that lawmakers, know that the Poison Center helps us. And I've been very fortunate that I work for a program that integrates with public health very intimately. Thank you very much.
Dr. Lopez, thank you. Any questions? The center is unique because it also contributes a very important toxicology resource for the world, an information resource called toxins. And oh, you are okay. Sounds good. So Gaylord is still on stage, and then we are going to look at the poisoning emergency from the scene to the poison center and beyond. And what they want to do here is they want to share with you various stages of poison center involvement with paramedics, with the hospital, etc., and how they are able to assist along the way.
Okay, so I'm going to open quickly on, again, poisoning is a public health issue. Both Lucy and I will be talking about what happens from the scene to eventually when you get seen. Because those of us who are in a poison center model where we have our poison specialists working primarily to provide information as opposed to, physicians who do it from start to finish, we're going to share with you a few cases where our poison specialists are the ones who are managing these very critically ill patients. And so, just as a reminder, my state is populated with 10.5 million people. The Poison Center is staffed with this kind of organization. We have poison specialists. We have 19 full-time people. We have computer people. We have trainers. We have residents. We have fellows. We are probably the most best staff group of toxicologists in all of the United States, with our resources at Georgia along with our resources with the CDC. The staff that primarily handles the emergencies are nurses, pharmacists, or physicians. So those are the people who work in our call center. And these are folks handling the calls on a daily basis. Now, I'm going to go over 4 cases really quickly, cases that we get on a day, very commonly, And it starts with these routine cases that our folks handle. So let's take case number 1, where we have a pharmacist who's calling the poison center for information. So the pharmacist is calling us about a 4-year-old patient who gets 4 tablets of iron pills. Now, what the mother is asking not the poison center, but the mother is asking her pharmacist for advice. Now, what I would have preferred the pharmacist to do is tell the mom to call the poison center, but instead he calls us. Okay, so that's not uncommon, but the pharmacist doesn't know what to do because they're not trained. So they call us and we take history, and so we put the pharmacist on hold, and what do? What is our next step? Well, I've been at these conferences and we've talked about the development of guidelines so that your staff can do the majority of work for you. So we have a guideline on our internal internet that allows us to look for cases that have specific protocols, specific actions you take. And when you go to our protocol book, you'll find that we do have a guideline on how to handle iron ingestions. So our poison specialist says, hey, let me read the protocol, let me see what has to be done. And when you read the protocol, you'll realize that for pediatric patients, we have a guideline of how much they could take without having to go into the hospital. So when you figure out that you could do calculations and realize that your patient did not get enough iron, you do your simple calculation. This is a case where we performed a calculation. We recognize it as being not a problem, being subtoxic. We decided to do an additional call 4 hours after they got a hold of us, and we realized that the patient only had minor effects, maybe some nausea and some vomiting, and then we decided to keep the patient at home and we closed the case. Very cost-effective way, and think about how much an emergency room visit would cost if this patient went directly to the hospital. Think about how much cost it would be if they just went to their pediatrician. And think about the time that it would take to do all this. The Poison Center, a public health partner, said we can do this, we could keep them at home, and these are one of the 85% of cases we keep at home. What about case number 2? A dad tells us that his 3-year-old son just had awoken from a nap. He took a nap for 5 hours, and when the child wakes up, he tells his father that he ingested a penny. And so again, a poison center is in place, the father recognizing that there is a resource for me to call instead of immediately going into the emergency room. He calls poison center. Now, for those physicians in the room, some of you are probably saying, oh, it's probably nothing, just leave it at home. Well, in order for us to make a decision, we turn to our guidelines again. Do I have a guideline on foreign bodies? And we take history, we look at our computer system, and wouldn't you know it, we have a guideline on foreign bodies and choking hazards. So our poison specialist goes into the guidelines and they read what is our medical backup wanting us to do in the event of foreign bodies. So again, this is not a case being handled by the medical toxicologist. This is a case being handled by the poison specialist who has direction from the medical toxicologist because we have a guideline written and approved by our medical toxicologist. Now, because our protocol advises that that patient needs to be seen, we want to make sure that the penny is beyond the esophagus. So how do we do that? You can't do that at home. You must take x-ray. So we were able to send to the hospital, they performed a abdominal x-ray, and they did isolate and find that the penny was in fact beyond the esophagus into the intestines, and the patient was now safely able to be discharged. Again, by following our guidelines, we were able to manage this case appropriately, tell the hospital in this case what has to be done. In fact, one of the key elements that we do is if we recognize a patient has to go in, we will call the hospital ahead of time and tell them a 3-year-old patient's coming in, this is what you have to do, this is what you have to monitor, so there'll be no waste of time. So again, it's by use of guidelines. The third case I want to talk about, mom, I told you about this earlier, decides to consult Dr. Google. So she's Googling what happens when you ingest Visine. Everyone's familiar with Visine, the eye drops, if you have red eyes, right? So now the internet tells her, this is a major problem. This is an issue. The mom's not sure what has to be done, but she tells us that the ingestion is not witnessed, and the kid is a little drowsy, but it may be nap time. So now the mom says, I read Dr. Google. It sounds like it's a problem, but let me talk to a real person. So she calls us, and after we take a history, we want to look up if we have a guideline. And wouldn't you know it? We have another guideline. We have a guideline for imidazoline compounds and vasoconstrictors. And when you look at our guideline, you'll notice that we have a specific protocol that if you have this ingestion, these symptoms, you must be evaluated. Again, these are written by the medical staff, Dr. Kazi, Dr. Geller, Dr. Morgan. These are the physicians who write these guidelines so that the staff has directions on what to do. It's not cases that you have to deal with on a minute-by-minute basis. Many poison centers have these guidelines, and they are basically instructions on what to do in the event of a particular type of exposure. As per our guidelines, we noted that the child had to be referred into the hospital. We went ahead again and called the hospital to say that little